Good morning, colleagues. First, I want to thank all of you for being here since 8 o'clock. I want to thank all of you for being as punctual as you were this morning. Unfortunately, our attempts to reach out to the administration to have DOA and DRT I thought had been received and that they were going to be here, but we've been advised that Revenue and Taxation is hosting a tax conference on Island today, and it's their last day of their conference, and they're trying to get somebody to come down. I thank Senator Snogestein also. He's been trying to reach out to get somebody to come down here to answer some of our questions on real property. We reached out to the Department of Administration, and we were assured by his office that he came in to the office at 7 o'clock this morning and had left and was on his way down here. So I thought that we were going to be able to start on time, but I apologize again for having you come in early and not being able to address it. What's the pleasure of the body? Should we just continue with the discussion on the amendment that I had proffered? If someone would chair, and because I think a couple of us
Good morning, colleagues. Speaker Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Just to recap, Mr. Chairman, last night before we broke, I offered an amendment a different version of real property tax increase that I had hoped that we were going to get through, but was not able to pass 2 days ago. So I thought maybe if I limited it to those pieces of property that were appraised at a value over $1 million, that I might be able to get the support of the colleagues. I wanted to make sure that we address some of the concerns that were raised the first day about whether or not the increase was going to affect people with wooden structures and lansu, and so I apologize. So I thought maybe if we just limited it to those appraised over $1 million, that there might be more of an appetite in the body to increase the property tax, which everybody has said really is something that should be addressed. And so I put that out there. I believe that I will at some point have to make some amendments that had been finally, I believe, cleared by everyone. And I think it should read on the third line, I believe it, has it been distributed, the new version? The revised version is that we would add, accepted the value of the improvements, comma, within the price.
Mr. Speaker, just for formalities, if you can withdraw the amendment that you proffered last night, and then we'll consider this.
Thank you very much. I apologize. Yes, if I can withdraw the amendment that I made last evening and instead resubmit this one this morning.
Okay, on that dual motion to withdraw the amendment that was proffered by Speaker Cruz last evening, and then to consider the amendment that is before you. On that, any objections? No objections, order. Speaker Cruz, you may continue.
Thank you very much. And so the new amendment reads that it adds the phrase, accepted the value of the improvements, comma, with an appraised value of $1 million or more as certified by the Board of Equalization each year, comma, shall be levied a yearly tax at the rate of 7/9. Such tax shall be assessed and collected in the manner prescribed in this chapter. All proceeds derived by the government under this provision shall be deposited in the Territorial Education Fund.
On Speaker Cruz' amendment, any discussion? Senator Esteves, Senator San Augustine. Senator Esteves, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I commend the mover of the amendment for looking into this in more detail and taking an alternative approach, I took time to consider the amendment that's before the body, tried to weigh the pros and cons, and at this time I cannot support this amendment. You know, at first glance, it looks reasonable. Just to put it in simplest terms, it looks like an additional tax on the rich or the well-to-do, and that's not necessarily a bad proposition if we're trying to equalize funds and contributions to the government as a result of taxation. But when I thought how this could affect those that are vulnerable or in most need, and the example I'd like to use is when we're talking about the value of a property or improvements on a property at $1 million or more, this is not just like mansions we're talking about. I think what we have, or hotels, I think what we have to consider is these could be apartment complexes on R2s. Apartments and rentals where the poor people live, or the manumku on fixed incomes. And I've talked about the effects of property tax because it's never focused. It touches everything. That's what happens when you start taxing the ground beneath people's feet, even though it's just improvements. The rates and the cost of rent for those that are already struggling is going to go up. Not to mention the small businesses that rent in these commercial complexes that may be valued at a $1 million or more. And so without further information from revenue and taxation, I cannot support this amendment. I think we are not looking at the consequences or potential consequences it's going to have on the poor. And so again, at face value, it looks like, you know, we're just trying to tax the well-to-dos, but I don't think that's going to be the case. And so with that, Madam Chairwoman, I cannot support this amendment.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, looking at this amendment, even after communicating with Revenue and Tax, the real property section, 2 days ago, after we talked about the increasing the taxes on people building ranches, putting containers on their property, that doesn't apply. When I spoke to them, they were talking about permanent structures. They were talking about homes that are built full concrete, or homes built by steel buildings and stuff like that. So with this amendment, I would support this amendment. I would actually ask that we maybe even amend it to bring it down. If not, even reconsider the vote that we did 2 days ago on the property tax. Because it's, as the previous speaker said, rates are going up. It has nothing to do with taxes. Rates have been going up. People renting today, the rates are going up. And they're nothing to do with taxes. They're going to raise it because the market is calling for the rate increase. I've known several people that own apartments. They used to rent it to $500. The market is driving it. It's now at $750, $1,000. If we want to worry about our constituents that can't afford it, then maybe we should consider the raising of the minimum wages so they can pay for what it's costing them today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, again, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'd like to also rise in opposition of this particular amendment. You know, I understand where the Chair of Appropriations is coming from in terms of trying to identify additional resources. But we have an opportunity now to be able to ensure that we look towards streamlining and reorganizing this government in response to what our people have been asking for and in response to what our people expect. And whether it's a tax increase to the rich and the wealthy, or whether it's in fact a tax increase elsewhere, I cannot support it, knowing full well that this government already generates more than sufficient revenues to be able to operate the basic, critical, and essential services of this government. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Again, would any other member wish to be recognized on this? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we consider the amendment, I think that it's important for us to get a handle on where we are as far as revenues and expenses. I know that we recently entertained a hotel occupancy tax increase that's supposed to have generated a certain amount. We've recently entertained a number of cuts that's supposed to have reduced expenses by a certain amount. And I know that those two items are within the greater context of the the real property tax increase that we did not do earlier in the week. So can we get a balance as to where we are right now, adding back the adding in the hotel occupancy tax and lessening out the cuts that we've made so far? How far off are we from balancing?
Thanks, Senator. Morning. Up to today, not considering the funds, because the different funds that have been increased and reduced, it would have to be adjusted on the spending side. But given all the amendments that have passed the past 3 days, the shortfall balance is $13,376,177. Again, that's $13,376,177.
Thank you. And the estimate that this particular amendment is supposed to be able to generate is?
The amendment at 1 million?
No, yes, the amendment at a 1 million RPT at 7/9%.
Our estimates, based on the amendment, would raise $8,211,889. $8,211,889.
881?
889.
9.
And that's based on the data that was sourced from Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Now, are we discounting, because you know how whenever you raise a local tax, they're able to deduct the local tax from their federal income tax. Are we offsetting local tax increases to potential federal tax revenue? So, for example, if we're talking about $1 million properties, these are likely commercial developments, which likely pay corporate income taxes. So are we doing a modifier where the 8 million, if this were to pass, that 8 million would reduce the corporate tax revenues by 25% of that 8 million?
Unfortunately not. We don't have that data, although I know Speaker has been asking for data relative to corporate tax specific data, but we don't have the ability to offset that amount. This is just taking 7/9 of the appraised value of property. Yeah.
So, Madam Chair, we have a $13,376,177 shortfall balance. This amendment would address $8,211,889, leaving us with a balance of $5,164,288. Just some perspective, Madam Chair, so that we can really have an idea of what this amendment will do in the grander scheme of the overall budget. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, just a point of information. On the same token, the offset with regards to deductions in taxable income, I'd also like to note that many of our agencies rent commercial properties, and an effect on the real estate property could very well affect that rate, which has been budgeted for in FY19. So while we're saying we are appropriating bare minimum inclusion of rent and workspace, we got to keep in mind that if we raise the real property tax on improvement, that could increase those rates and what they're being charged, which is not budgeted for.
Thank you, Senator. Any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? Vice Speaker Terlahi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to find out if OFB has information to tell us whether the property owners that they said there are 400 that might be affected. That was the information given to us last night by the speaker. For the 400 that will be affected, can you tell whether those are corporations versus private landowners? Or can you tell the zone of the property?
The data that was provided to us, which was the evening 2 nights ago, there is no names that we were provided. It was just the value of the properties. There was no lot numbers. It was just value of the property.
No
Appraised
zoning.
value and assessed value.
All right.
So we weren't able to identify if there's any, which one is corporate or which one's not corporate.
Residential.
Yeah.
Okay, what about, could you just give us a sample? If it's $1 million property, what's the tax? What's the change in tax?
Just need a little more time for that.
We'll take a brief recess.
Oh, okay. Just the change. What's the change from the?
The legislature's back in session.
Thanks, Vice Speaker, for the question. We'll just use an example. Appraised value of a property at 1.49 million. The tax on that specific improvement would be 5,796 currently. So if you double that, that would be the impact. So on a property that's appraised value of 1.49, the tax would be around 5,000, and then if you double it, it'll be another 5,000.
Thank you very much. My next comment is just kind of technical. I can see why the sponsor added the words as certified by the Board of Equalization each year, but this is not in the current statute, so I would hesitate to add that in right now. I think they're already interpreting this law based on other statutes, and I would just leave the word value. I would even take out the word appraised and do exactly what the existing statute does. It says it's based on the value of the improvements thereon, and let the other laws interpret this law as they've been doing, just so that we don't create any problem that we can't foresee right now by using the word appraised or by saying as certified each year. Just leave it as it is. So I would just make a motion to remove those words just to be safe. And the word appraised and the words as certified by the Board of Equalization each year.
There's been an amendment to the Cruz amendment by Vice Speaker Terlahi to remove the word appraised on the third line and the words as certified by the Board of Equalization each year. Any member wish to be heard on the Senator Siniclas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I need to object to that amendment. The reason why that language is critical is because the statute is creating a new threshold to determine a tax rate, and that threshold is a valuation determination. We need a legal basis for that valuation determination. If we remove the words appraised, and if we remove the words Board of Equalization, then we're basically just saying improvements with a value of $1 million shall be levied a tax rate of 7/9%. How would that value be determined? Someone can just say, I think it's $1 million, and someone can say, no, I don't think so. And then when they go and they dispute it, because the way these taxes are adjudicated is they go before the Board of Equalization. And someone will say, well, no, I don't think it's worth that much. And they'll say, where in the statute do you have the specified valuation determination? And since it's not going to be in the statute, they can make the argument that I'm not going to be paying the taxes until the government is clear on how they're determining my value. Because there's so many different ways to determine value. And so I think that this language is critical because it gives a legal basis for valuation determination based on what the appraised value is as certified by the board, because every year the Board of Equalization needs to certify the tax rolls. And so if they certify it based on that appraised value, then there's a legal basis for why they're saying it's $1 million property that needs to be assessed at a different rate. If we remove that language, there's no legal basis for the valuation determination. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. On the Terlahi amendment, we'll have Senator Munya and then Senator San Agustin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, actually, I was questioning the word appraised value because I wasn't sure. I was going to wait till Mr. Camacho was here to ask him if Department of Revenue and Taxation actually does appraisals. And if they don't, do they have to order it if they don't have one? I do feel, though, according to the amendment, that we should keep the certified by the Board of Equalization, only because we do need that in there. But my question is, does the word appraised, does DRT do appraisals? I'm not sure. I do know that they have assessed values already, but I'm not sure if they have appraised values. So if they don't, do they have to order it? And who's going to pay for that?
Does the mover of the amendment yield to the question?
Yes, thank you for the question, Madam Chair. This is very important. It's a very important legal matter, I think, that we currently tax real property. We currently do that according to this statute, the language that's not underlined. It says we're going to tax real property and we're going to tax and 7/18 of the value of the improvements thereon. And that's the only language they use to currently tax improvements. And they get their definitions of value by other statutes where they clarify between appraised and assessed and these equalization updates every year. And the challenge, there's a whole other set of statute that allows the appraised value to be challenged every year. And that's what I'm saying. I think it's very important that we don't affect those other statutes and their current interpretations with the words value of the improvements thereon. That's all they use to currently tax improvements. And so I think we intend to tax improvements the same way. We don't intend to create a whole new system. So I'm suggesting that we leave the words as close as possible to the original language, and we just say the value of the improvements over $1 million. And take out all those extra words because there's a big, sometimes they use the word appraised, sometimes they use the word assessed. And so I think throwing that in here, appraised value for property over 1 million, when they don't use that word in this statute for the value of those less than 1 million, it's a potential to create a legal issue that we don't have right now, and we don't need right now, I don't think. Same thing with the Board of Equalization. That's already an existing process, and I don't think we need to, if you will, fool around with it in this statute. I think if we want to do anything with that, we need to go to that statute and be very precise about what we're going to do there. So I just think it's very safe to use the exact same language that Revenue Tax is using right now to tax improvements. They say we're going to take 7/18 of the value of the improvements thereon.
Okay, thank
They
you.
don't use the word appraised, they don't use the word equalization, they don't do any of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Muñoz?
So, Madam Chair, I'm just wondering if maybe then they should be two separate amendments, like taking out appraised as a separate amendment and then taking out the as certified by the Board of Equalization. Or does she just feel like they both should be in there or taken out at the same time?
I think we can keep it in one amendment. Senator San Augustine?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would actually ask that maybe on the amendment that we add the word certified appraised value. Because there are appraisers out there, they submit that. The Department of Revenue and Taxation, the Board of Equalization, they all go through that and they double check to make sure that the value is in fact certified.
Thank you, Senator. Let's dispense with the Terlahi amendment, and then if you'd like to proffer yours after, then we can consider that.
All right.
Thank you. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm trying to understand how this process would work. So if I can ask you, and if I can ask the guidance of any of our colleagues in the room who understand the entire process, because when in fact a property owner would like to construct a facility in excess of $1 million, where would they go? They would go to DPW, acquire the necessary permits, ensure that they get that construction permit to build on their property. And then my question is, when is an assessment on appraisal done on the completed structure so that it gets to revenue tax? Is there a connect in this process where anything in excess, this would now require that anything in excess of $1 million in improvements by DPW, they would have to forward that information to revenue tax. So revenue tax would annotate it and then have the assessment or the appraised value conducted on an annualized basis. I'm just trying to understand this because I don't see where the connect is other than the every 3 years requirement, which has not been met too regularly, but the requirement where the government of Guam would assess the value of properties island-wide. Other than that particular assessment, I don't know where the connect is between DPW permitting and granting the construction and the expansion of facilities or the construction of new facilities on their property and revenue tax. Can someone, if the chairperson of revenue tax can provide that information before I even consider the amendment before us? Madam Chair?
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Senator Cruz, you're recognized.
If I can, Madam Chair, in the last OPA audit on the real property tax, that was one of the criticisms that the OPA had about this entire thing, was that DPW and land management are not communicating with Department of Revenue and Taxation. That's the reason why you have 17 pages or 3,500 John Does in the roll currently, is because those two agencies are not communicating. One of the criticisms that the OPA had was that they found that there were whole condos that weren't even on the rolls yet. But the fact that they haven't been assessed over the last couple of years doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering taxing them in the future, and hoping that as a result of the OPA audit of 2 months ago, that the communication between the building permit of $1 million, the mortgage payment, that's at land management of over $1 million doesn't all get to revenue and taxation, that they can have it. If we're going to wait until revenue and taxation has that all set up, I'm not sure what his administration will be over by then. Because I just haven't figured out how to be able to get them to communicate with each other. But I'm proposing this amendment, and while I have the floor, I think maybe the Vice Speaker might be correct in that if we tinker as little as possible with the statute, we might be safer. But Senator Snoggerstein has informed me that the Director of Revenue Taxation is on his way here now. And should be here shortly, and so we can get his take on this. If I know I hate to keep going back and forth, but they're finally responding. I kept sending texts to everybody, and they're finally responding, and he is coming, and Mr. Byrne is here. So.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much for that information, Mr. Speaker, because it certainly highlights incorporating or making amendments to existing law, and with the anticipated revenue projection from this of $8.2 million, how can that be realized if the agencies are not communicating? So it's certainly a situation that we need to present to Rev and Tax and see how they would be able to enforce not only existing laws, but any additional amendments by virtue of this budget. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Any other member wish to be heard on the Terlahi amendment? If not, I'll invite the Vice Speaker to close.
I support her amendment that as little tinkering with the statute may be in the best interest. But again, I'm saying that the Director of Revenue Taxation is on his way, and if we could just wait a few minutes, we can finally get the word on how they would be able to do it, as was said by the Oversight Chair and the former employee at the Revenue Taxation. Maybe if we can get that word, we might be able to address this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we'll table this amendment, and we'll give the Director of Administration and Director of Revenue and Tax 1 minute to come in, and then we'll resume.
Thank you very much. The Committee of the Whole is back in order. Over the last several days, there's been question as to whether or not we have enough savings taken into account into the budget. And one savings was whether or not we had taken into account the possibility of the health insurance showing a savings this year. And so I've asked the Director of Administration to come in this morning as he is the chair of the negotiating team, and thank him for his letter the other day informing us about where negotiations are. And I believe, Senator Uggan, you were most interested in this, so I'll allow you to have the first set of questions to the Director.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Burns, thank you for joining us this morning. Just a couple of questions, and obviously in this case, in this budget, we're trying to identify where additional revenues could be identified or a reduction in expenditures of the government could occur to be able to carry us into the fiscal year 2019. Public Law 34-83, which was enacted through an override by this body in February earlier this year, requires now that the most economical proposal be presented to the governor. And I need to make sure that our people understand the most economical proposal could be a singular insurance company, or it could be, please correct me if by any chance I'm off base in the process, but the most economical proposal could also be inclusive of up to 3 carriers, insurance carriers, that would provide a lower cost. So it would be one or the other. Now,
that is
because
correct.
that is public law, I'm looking at some of the information in the past. The Speaker, through his presentation on the passage of that legislation, alluded to in the last fiscal years that it could have realized up to $20 million in reduction of government contributions to the health insurance policy. So my question to you is, as much as you can share, because there are specific information in any discussion that we are not privy to until the protest is completed. We know that the process right now is being protested. So just if you can explain the timelines and when you could possibly anticipate the process for the protest being concluded, and then I do have some follow-on questions, please.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning.
Good morning.
The process was started under my predecessor, and I believe it was done with sufficient time. In the absence of any barriers, we would have reached a conclusion by now. Unfortunately, one of the potential bidders filed a protest with OPA regarding the content of the RFP. And effectively, the whole process has been stayed as a result of that. We have responded to their protest, and the bidder decided to file a supplemental protest, to which we have just responded. In addition to that, there was some information that was required by the OPA to be provided to the hearing officer, and we provided that information too. The latest information we have from OPA is that a scheduling conference has been set for mid-September. Seems a long time away, I agree, but that was a date set by the hearing officer, and we had no control over that. So with that in mind, we wrote to the Speaker confirming that we obviously weren't going to reach a conclusion by July 31st, but it's also very difficult to determine or even guess what date this will conclude, because we have to either have the stay removed or have the hearing completed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burns. In addition, and I certainly appreciated the letter that you provided to the Speaker yesterday. I did question the timing, because obviously July 31st was the day before the receipt of the letter, but that's neither here nor there. Has DOA communicated with the insurance carriers about any possible extension?
We're getting towards the negotiating confidentiality, so I'm going to try and choose my words really carefully, and I hope you'll understand that, is that we feel that we still have an obligation to provide health insurance for government employees. So we certainly have communicated with the existing carriers Hopefully I can just leave it at that.
Can I ask if by any chance this body can get a copy of that communique with the insurance carriers? And the reason being is because right now the government of Guam is about ready to obligate the government and our taxpayers to continue, rightfully so, because of the timelines that you shared with us, continue the health insurance coverage for our public employees. Now, based on that and the notification to the insurance carriers, can I request a copy of that particular communique to the insurance carriers?
Happily, there is a meeting of the negotiating committee this afternoon, so I will discuss that with them. Personally, I think I see no reason why you shouldn't get a copy of that, but I would like to get our legal consultant just to comment on it.
So, DOA, as the primary administrator of the program, Mr. Speaker, is on the verge of continuing a health insurance coverage and to cover our public employees for a time certain, whether it's the entire fiscal year, next fiscal year. I know you alluded to possibly a shorter time frame yesterday, Mr. Speaker, but that communique, I see absolutely no reason why this body should not be privy to that information. It's a document that says, that may say, allude to, because of the ongoing protests, we would have to consider the possibility of extending. So once again, Mr. Speaker, if I can request from Mr. Burns a copy of that particular communique for the members of the body.
He has heard it, and I believe he will have to get back to legal counsel. A number of us who have signed the non-disclosure agreement can only disclose as much as without having another protest because we say something. So if you can just give us a little time for him to clear with our legal counsel as to whether or not any other information is and can be sent besides that letter that he sent us yesterday.
Unless the letter does highlight any intricacies of the agreement, that's a different story because obviously, but it's not part of the negotiation. You are looking right now at possibly extending the existing contractual arrangement with insurance carriers, Mr. Speaker. The existing contractual arrangement. You're not deviating from what is provided in fiscal year 18. You're asking these carriers, if in fact the protest is not resolved within a reasonable time frame, then we will need to consider extending it into the next fiscal year. So it's not, we will need to consider, but we're going to deviate from the agreements and increase the premium. Or we're going to deviate from the agreements and reduce the overall cost to this government. That is not, at least when you're looking at existing contractual arrangements, deviate. So if there's any deviation, it's not a renegotiation, Mr. Speaker. It's a notification that should it be necessary that this government will have to continue existing arrangements, will you consider or will you concur to participating in this process? It is, and you are committing, when we're talking about a figure that was shared with me yesterday, if I can get the director of OFB to allude to what the government's contribution is for fiscal year 18 for the health insurance policy.
Senator, if I could just comment on what you were saying earlier in your preface. You know, yes, we can send a letter requesting that the carrier continues the coverage. There are certain laws that indicate which part of the coverage they may or may not continue, but it is up to the carrier in the end to agree to that, and it's two parties.
I understand.
We can't
Mr. Burns,
force
Mr.
a carrier
Speaker,
to
I
do something.
understand. If there's any deviation or proposed deviation from the existing contractual arrangement, then I understand if you're going to apply those deviations. But because you're asking the people of Guam, based on the initial figure, and I'm still waiting for the figure to be provided, asking the people of Guam to pay for the upcoming fiscal year an additional expense, possibly for the protracted entire year, upwards of $70 million on behalf of the government of Guam to cover our public employees for the entire year or for even a shorter time frame, that is not information that I consider restricted. It's not part of a negotiation. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, they're getting the number, but I know Senator Ada asked to be the next one to question, but I believe the Oversight Health Chair has some information that he might be able to share.
Then, Mr. Speaker, can I just get a timeline of when Mr. Burns, I appreciate your response. I just differ with you in regards to this, especially when we're about ready to invest and to spend the people's money into the next fiscal year and not even knowing what the cost is going to be. But can I once again request a timeline of when you will be able to respond to this body on whether that letter will be provided to members of this body?
I think, as I said, Senator, there happens to be a meeting of the negotiating committee this afternoon. So I will certainly raise it then and get back to the legislature.
The request is a continuance of existing terms and conditions, Mr. Burns. It's not a negotiation. It's whether, in fact, these insurance carriers would like to participate for whatever time frame in the next fiscal year. It's not a renegotiation of the existing contract. So that's why I'm requesting a copy of that letter to the insurance carriers, and I need a time frame of when you can get back to this body, whether you will be providing it or not. And I need a copy.
As I said, there's a meeting of the negotiating committee this afternoon. I will take.
So how soon can you get a response to the chair, to the speaker?
After that meeting.
When is your meeting? I'm sorry, Mr. Burns?
This afternoon.
Okay.
At 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Did you want to add some information, and then the question will go back to Senator Ada, who wanted to be next.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for being here. And I think just to help out in the discussion, because I do know how sensitive the information is and what you're bound by in the agreements that we have to sign. But for the record, and something that I know that we can speak about, is what is on the contract. And the contract itself is public record. And there is a provision there for a guaranteed renewability of health insurance coverage. That's in the contract. It's also afforded by federal law, the Health Portability Act, you know, and so those are all, it's guaranteed that we'll be able to renew at least on a temporary basis, the existing contract you have. And also based on the contract, I believe, is that the rates, at least for the 90 days, the first 90 days, the rates and the plan designs must remain the same in any rollover period. And so that's part of the contract that the government signs with the carriers. And again, it's also pursuant to federal law that guarantees guaranteed renewability of a health insurance coverage if it's invoked by the clients, which is the government of Guam. So I think the employees should know that even in this protest, employees, retirees, and dependents should know that they would have coverage, and that the insurance negotiating team the government of Guam has invoked that part of the contract. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ada, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think your predecessor before you had the health chair position was the one that wanting the rollover provision. And so, Senator Ada.
Thank you. Mr. Burns, with this procurement process, protest process that's in place, I mean, under the worst possible conditions, this could take months. Do you agree? Because even, depending, even if the OPA gets through and comes out with its findings, that doesn't end it there, because if it doesn't come out in favor of the protestant, he certainly still has the final option of seeking judicial relief and filing in Superior Court. So that could further lengthen, stretch out this protest.
Yes, Senator.
Now, so I guess for budget planning purposes, and having to make certain reasonable assumptions, for example, that all the current carriers will continue to provide the coverage services. Is it reasonable to assume that the amount that government of Guam paid this year could be used as the same amount for fiscal year 19?
Yes, I think it could.
For budget planning
For
purposes?
budget purposes,
Okay.
yes.
I guess if there's, are you aware of anything in that the current arrangement that if the number of participants in the program is reduced, that could cause the insurance rates to rise?
You're asking me, I think, to speculate on how the underwriters view their medical population. It certainly could. Of course, if the number of participants falls, then the cost also falls because you've got fewer participants. So you've got two unknowns in there. So it would be very hard to speculate upon what the final result of such an adjustment would be.
So I guess it's reasonable to say that for budget planning purposes, we probably should use the current amount that was budgeted for fiscal year 2018. Would you agree with that?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. But otherwise, to wait around for this protest to be concluded, that could take months. And if it should be elevated to to go to the Superior Court, that could be even much longer. So I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Does anybody have any further questions of Mr. Byrne? Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne, the rollover provision in the current contract, does it, or do any other laws allow for the rates to go up as opposed to staying the same?
My understanding is that the rollover provisions in the contract maintain the rates, but the legislation that the Senator Rodriguez was talking about requires some continuation, but is silent on the rates.
So what is the committee's conclusion about a rollover? Would we budget the same amount, or is there potential for or do the carriers get to set the rate during the rollover period? What's your conclusion on that?
Not under the contractual part, but under any extension beyond the contractual commitment, they have the ability, but not necessarily the desire, to increase the rates. But I don't, like Senator Adams was saying, I don't think we have any better information than the information we already have.
But what is this extension? Is that the contractual part, or is that outside the contractual part? I mean, what's
the word extension is kind of not a very good word, but
the rollover.
There is a contractual commitment that the carriers signed when they signed the contract to carry over for 90 days. Any extension beyond that, which may be thought desirable by the committee, would be outside the contract.
All right. So for 90 days, we would have the same rates, presumably, and after that, it's pretty much up to the carriers to set the rates.
Well, it's up to us to negotiate
accept. Yeah. Okay.
Rates.
All right. Thank you. And what about who in the committee decides whether the protest is valid or not? Because the protest, you said, you responded, I guess you said it was not valid and you wanted to continue to fight it. I haven't looked at the protest documents, but is it a committee decision or is it one person's decision?
No, all the decisions, Senator, are committee decisions taken by majority vote.
Majority vote, all right.
With advice from our legal counsel.
All right. I'm concerned too about the length of time involved in the negotiation, and it's my understanding, and please let us know, that original protest was made during the solicitation period. Is that correct? Or are you at another stage of the procurement right now?
The protest was a protest regarding the RFP.
Okay. In addition to deciding whether the protest is valid or not, and given the timelines, does the committee consider whether, it would save more time to cancel the solicitation and restart?
Well, Senator, you're bordering upon the information that's part of the current negotiation. I guess I'd would want to say this, that obviously any committee looking at a commercial proposition would want to make sure that the end result is as commercially sensible as possible. But I prefer to leave it at that, if I may.
Yes, well, the result of pursuing this course that we're on looks to me potentially very expensive. We've got a protest to deal with, maybe now a second one, and we've got after 90 days, the potential increase in rates for coverage of maybe, depending on your negotiations, but that's very possible. And we're not, definitely precludes us from the savings that my colleague was talking about in, a new negotiation, right? The swifter we get to that, the sooner, hopefully, if the speaker's correct, that we get to a cheaper health insurance plan.
I certainly think it is a peculiarity of the procurement law. In most other procurement protests, the money hasn't been spent, and the protest delays the spending of money. In this particular case, we don't have that luxury. I agree.
Thank you. Do you agree that if there wasn't a protest, and under the current statutes and your negotiation and your committee's parameters, that there is a potential in a new contract for savings?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
I guess the basis of all of this was that there is a potential for a $20 million reduction in savings. That's what one of my colleagues said from in the new contract because of the provisions that have been changed in law. Do you agree that there's that kind of potential?
Frankly, I'm challenged to accept that it could be 20. It could be anything. Part of insurance is complex. Medical insurance is more complex. So the proposal that came out of the last negotiation for an exclusive provider may or may not, and I don't know what the situation was, may or may not have restricted access to contracted facilities or not. I don't know what the situation was, and it's hard for me to judge whether that actually turns into a dollar saving.
It's my understanding that the solicitation that's being protested right now includes as mandatory requirements things that are not mandatory by law right now. Is that correct?
Things are not.
For example, access to facilities, certain facilities that were not required by law, but those are being required in the solicitation.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Well, I'm just concerned because if there's a potential to save by entering into a new contract as soon as possible, then I'm just hoping that in your committee meeting you can consider, the cost of continuing to fight the protest as opposed to canceling the solicitation. I don't know if it's possible or not because I'm not privy to your information, but if it's possible to cancel it and resolicit and get to that solution faster, and especially if there's a cost savings that's possible. And I'm, of course, very concerned about the road we're on. Looks to me like potentially increasing costs beyond what we are even budgeting for. And I guess what would be the effect, do you think, on everything if we put a cap in this budget on, well, it's like we're doing right now, we're putting a cap on the health insurance.
Okay, if I could respond to the first part of your question, having come from the private sector and having had to purchase medical insurance for the companies that I was CFO of for some years, my advice to the committee certainly is take the best commercial path to get to the goal we need to get to, and that's to get an economic policy and still service the medical needs of, or hopefully preventative needs, medical preventative needs of government employees. If you were to put a cap on the amount, and that's kind of what a budget is, right? It's a kind of cap. Then I'm sure the insurance companies would look to that number and try and operate and set their rates to maximize their return within that number.
All right, thank you. So what is your opinion on setting a cap that recognizes a savings at this point?
Recognizes which savings, Senator?
The savings that my colleagues have been talking about, that potential savings from the recent law that was passed.
Well, it depends how you calculate the savings. I think first of all, even if you accept that the savings are 20 million, that 20 million includes all the autonomous agencies, all the retirees. So it's not, the effect on the general fund is considerably less than that amount, so whatever that amount is.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Byrne. Oh, can I ask a separate question, not related to the health insurance, Mr. Speaker? Just wanted to know, I asked you this, and thank you for your response earlier about the increase in liquid fuels tax has been going into the highway fund.
Yes.
And DPW said they can't use that money without an appropriation. Do you agree with that, or are you able to remove funds from the highway fund without legislative appropriation?
I agree that we need an appropriation to remove that unless there's an existing appropriation, because it's a continuing appropriation, an existing appropriation that covers their need.
All right. Has any money been transferred out of that fund to another purpose?
No.
Thank you very much, Mr. Byrne.
Senator Torres? Anybody else? Senator Torres.
Mr. Byrne, thank you for your responses. I just wanted to get some clarification on some points that you made. You had mentioned that under the existing contract with the insurance companies, there is a provision for an extension of up to 90 days of the contract. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
All right. Given that statement, and then your other statement that we have a hearing on the procurement protests scheduled for September or thereabouts, what would be the tendency of the committee, given that you have a 90-day extension provision in the existing contract, but the timeline with which the protest begins to be resolved is extended to very close to the start date of the next fiscal year contract? What would be the tendency of the committee? Because I'm wondering if, in a practical mind, would the committee be inclined to roll over and extend the existing contract beyond the 90 days, or exhaust the protest and possibly resolve it so that there is a contract that is instead calendar year to calendar year as opposed to fiscal year to fiscal year? Because if you're thinking about the protest and the resolving of the protest, then by your own estimate, it won't be resolved in time for a new contract to be entered into effective October 1. What I'm getting at is, what are we really talking about? Are we throwing in the towel at this point because a protest has been made and there's just no way to advance the most economical model or proposal because we will not have reached that point in time? What realistically can we expect? Because it seems like the timelines are going to dictate the action of the committee even today, and I just want to get some confirmation from you of what it is that we expect will be the outcome.
Senator, I can't speak for every member of the committee, and as I just said, decisions of the committee are taken by majority vote. I certainly, I kind of balk at the idea of throwing in the towel. That's not something that I would ever want to ever have said has been done. But we have to operate within the law, and I have to say, we have taken very great pains as a committee to operate within the very complex legal structure that's been given us. As the protester is obviously one of the current carriers, so they're in the position of offering a service to their members and protesting the RFP. And we have to recognize that. So I hope you don't think that anybody has taken the easy way out here. It's really, really complex, and I think we're trying to take our very best to pick our way through all the regulations and the laws to make sure that there isn't further grounds for protest.
And I can appreciate that, but we also know in other schemes within our democratic process, there are measures that can fast track in certain circumstances. Unfortunately, it seems like procurement laws work against us in this case. We have legislation that mandates that only the most economical and cost-effective proposal will be advanced for consideration. But then the protests, the laws, the procurement laws also have a defined process. That in comparison to, for example, what we would do in the judicial system when we had an immediate and pressing issue that can leapfrog and a writ can be filed, for example, for immediate and expedient attention. I think that's what I'm driving at is without that sort of an option here, whether in an expedient option in the procurement process and the procurement protest process, my very simple question is, it appears, based on what you're saying, that those exceptions to the process don't exist in procurement law. And unlike in the judiciary, for example, where you can file a writ and it's expediently addressed to meet certain needs and timelines. In this case, I suppose what we're arriving at is a conclusion that there is no expediency. So the likelihood is we will not move forward with negotiations for a contract separate and different from the existing contract, perhaps, by the fiscal year deadline.
I think that is a consequence of the existing contract not having been protested and the current process having been protested. We are required to follow the procurement law.
Right.
There is no doubt about that, and we have no alternative.
Yes, I'm not. I don't mean to badger that point. I'm just raising the point because, for purposes of budgeting, if we had to anticipate a cost, an associated cost, which we know under the current scenario, because a protest has been filed, that more than likely or actually the most cost-effective proposal will not be the one to be advanced for consideration. That we may in fact be resigned and forced to continue with status quo. And for purposes of budgeting, that's what I'm trying to arrive at. So thank you for allowing me the long way around that point, which is what I'm trying to drive in, is that if you're going to peg a number to insurance, while we had aspired and actually passed legislation to arrive at a lower cost, we will not in fact realize that this fiscal year.
Well, that's true. It's a consequence of the process. I mean, this has happened in past years, and I think the rollover on that occasion was for a whole year, and I'm not sure how the legislature dealt with that, but the consequence was that rates and benefits, if after negotiation, were rolled over for 12 months.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne.
Any other senator wish to pose it? Senator Espaldon, and then we'll go back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burns, good morning. Just a simple question. I'm going to take a little different track on this one. You mentioned earlier that, of course, you had come from the private sector and you had dealt with insurance negotiations before in that capacity. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
I just need to ask, in the private sector, at least in the experience that you have had and perhaps the knowledge you have, what is the normal contribution rate of the member? The business, what is, in a business, what normally is the cut? Is it 50-50, where the employer pays 50% and the employee pays 50%? What's your experience?
It really depends upon the company and the employees in there. The previous company I came from immediately before coming to Guam had a lot of minimum rate wage people. So they, if you take a large amount for insurance out of their packet, because they're minimum rate people, you're taking out a large sum of the take-home pay. One of the companies I was at provided 100%, but that's probably the exception. I'm not sure, you know, I think that the public auditor tried to look at, she tried to compare not private sector, but public sector contributions, and we were not badly placed in that table. But private sector has many different considerations, so it could be anything. It can't be less than 50% under the Affordable Care Act.
I'm sorry?
It can't be less than 50% under the Affordable Care Act, but it could be anywhere between 50 and 100%.
Less on the employer's contribution you're talking about?
No, less on the, yes, on the employer's contribution under the Affordable Care Act,
Right.
can't be less than 50%.
All right. Under the GovGuam plans, what is the split?
The public auditor came up with these numbers that for employees, the government contribution is about somewhere between 71 and 76%. So I took an average of 74%. And for retirees, because of the way the law is written, it's more like 92%.
That's the government contribution.
The government contribution, yes.
Okay. Okay. And is that contribution set in law? Excuse me for my ignorance.
No. The issue with the retirees is that the amount that the retirees pay cannot be more than what employees pay, and so that skews the amount that the government has to pay for them.
Okay. But on the non-retirees, is that contribution rate by the government set in law, or is that?
No, it's set by the government.
It's set by the government.
Yes.
In the negotiation, or I guess as a policy.
It's set as a policy, but it's one of the things that the carriers look at that, when they set their rates.
So in essence, we're not counting retirees at this, well, I guess we can, but all inclusive in general, the members, us, we pay roughly 25, 26% of the
Yes.
cost, and the government pays a 75%.
Yes.
And that's set not in law, but by regulation,
No, I think by policy.
by
not
policy,
by-
in
by-
law,
not by
statutory
regulation.
law. Speaker, would you read?
There is a provision in law that says that the retiree shall not pay more in their category than the active employee.
Right, but in terms of, if I may, just for a little more, in terms of what an active employee would pay, is that set in law?
No. The split is done by the executive, but whatever the split is, the amount that the retiree is to pay shall not be more than the active employee in that same category.
Right,
So,
okay. And I can appreciate that. I guess the point in my mind is if we are in a certain, well, if we are in the situation that we find ourselves in, which is a financial crunch, and the government is paying for 75, let's call it 75% of contributions for the payment of insurance, there is always the consideration of the possibility of the government contribution shrinking a little bit from 75 to 70 and placing it more on the employees. And again, I just bring that up, not that I'm proposing it, but it's a possibility and a consideration to be able to realize some savings to the government itself. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that certainly would be an option, as there are other options to reduce government employees' take-home pay in order to save costs.
Right. But considering the fact that under the new federal tax laws, of course, that they have, they have decreased the amount of taxes, the individuals have decreased, a decreased amount of taxes they would pay in, right? So, and I'm just saying, that's just one of the considerations when you factor that into a bigger picture. But in total, can I just ask, or maybe you can answer, Mr. Burns, how much in total do we spend, do we contribute to the government insurance plan? What is our 74%? What is the dollar amount?
Well, I don't have the number
Roughly.
Because it includes the autonomous agencies. But if you took like 3/4 of the 101 million or 98 million, it's
Okay.
roughly 70.
About 70,
75
75,
million.
somewhere
Right.
around there. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Esteves?
Just a side question. So the split, that's statutory, correct? For what the government is required to pay?
No.
Now, do the autonomous agencies, do they have flexibility to adjust that themselves?
I'd have to ask each agency because they all operate under separate personnel regulations.
So again, with the process, so in order to extrapolate what the government of Guam, let's say government of Guam Pure, contributes towards at the current rate of, let's say 74%, right? But you said you'd have to pull that because the autonomous agencies are included in that? Is that your statement?
No, sir. What I said was that you asked me whether the autonomous agencies are bound by the same proportions. And I think that's up to the autonomous agency because they have their own personal regulations.
All right, I'm saying
But
to the
if I could-
previous statement. So
But
I
if
think
I-
you were asked how
Yeah.
much we contribute based on that 74%, and you mentioned something about autonomous agencies. Could you reiterate?
No, I was asked how much is the government share, and the government share of the total, this total negotiation, this purchase of medical insurance includes the autonomous agencies. So that total that we spoke about, the 100 million, that was used to derive, I think, the 20 million
Correct.
includes the autonomous agencies. But can I repeat something I said earlier, that the carriers are interested in the employee contribution because in their view it affects the rates because it affects their risk.
So of the total number, based on the negotiation, that includes Governor of Guam, which is what we're proposing forward, 74% currently with the current rate. And you said that's inclusive of the autonomous agencies, but whatever rate they have set in their rules and regulations.
Yes, I think, but I would need to check this, that at this moment they've all adopted the same. I'm not sure about the judiciary because they have their own policy, but anybody under this policy has adopted the same split, but I'd have to check that.
Okay, now I understand the autonomous agencies. Now, does the judiciary have the ability to adjust the rates themselves in terms of what their employer contribution is?
I believe so, but under the current policy, they're not participating in this. They have their own policy in this current year.
Now, because do you pay directly, or does that pay? Do you know if that's paid directly by the judiciary based on the allotments given to them to pay for their own health insurance?
No, DOA doesn't pay, so they must, right?
So you allot it to them, and then they pay for their own health insurance?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess the line of questioning is just to wonder, because if we're going to be pulling back, if we're looking at potentially making a movement to pull back that government contribution at 74% and putting it more on the employee, I think there might be, some discussion in terms of parity, especially with the times. And it was just interesting because I think if it was something that was set in statute and how it affects the autonomous agencies, I wonder if such an adjustment in the apportionment, whether, for example, the autonomous agencies are paying at 75%, 80%, if some reduction and movement and liability is increased on the employee, could that affect their overall operations and things like rates, power rates, for example, or allow us on the judiciary side to pull back some appropriation? So I think what I'm asking is, if the government is suffering based on taxation, are the autonomous agencies or the courts basically living like nothing's happening and able to put blinders on? So I just want to know that if we're going to be cutting back on our apportionment, or if we're even looking at that as an option, are people still out there with Cadillac plans on the taxpayer dime? Thank you, Mr. Byrne.
Senator Adams.
Mr. Burns, the procurement law encourages that whenever disputes arise, that they be, that we try to settle it at the lowest level possible. So when the one protestant filed its protest, did the committee try to negotiate and resolve that at its level before it got elevated to the OPA?
Yes, but please don't ask me to go any further than that, because that would be privileged information.
Fine. I'm trying to think how to couch my question without, I know where you are, the predicament that you are in here. We've all read in the paper what the basis of the protest is, in that the RFP requires that the providers be able to cover the subscribers at either of the two hospitals. And one protestant said, well, no, we don't want to provide for services at the particular facility. Is that an issue that that could be brought back to the table and say, okay, fine. Our bottom line is to provide health coverage services for the GovGuam employees. And as long as that can be met, then, I mean, the ideal situation is that you can provide health service coverage at facility Hospital 1 and Hospital 2. But if that's going to cause us to go into the black hole of protest and all that, that may be just requiring going back and issuing an amendment to the RFP so that health coverage is provided, albeit just at one facility. Is that something that the committee even talked about? And I guess I'm asking, I'm not trying to, I'm not interested in trying to you know, resolve the protest issue here, more so than, you know, if that's what it takes, so that we can obtain that possibly lower insurance cost and move on with this thing. Is that something that is even something that can be thought about? Answer it if you want or not.
Again, I'm trying to pick my way through it just the same as you were, Senator, in framing your question. I think that you can be reasonably assured that the committee, that thought did cross most of the members of the committee's mind. But at this stage, the committee decided that wasn't, that restricting the access to hospitals is not the way to proceed in the exclusive option. So it may, any committee can reconsider, and it may do so in the light of what has transpired. And we've learned that this process is going to take such a long time. But I can't speak for what the committee members might decide in the future.
Any other senator who hasn't asked a question wish to be addressed? All right, then we'll go second round. We'll go with Senator Uggan and then Senator Escobar.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think we need to be very cautious at this juncture. I think that we just need to establish today that because of the protest, we're unable to factor in the savings that we would have liked to factor in from the insurance contract in our budget. But I think that the more we engage in conversations with respect to this protest, the more we open the door for additional protests. And while the agency may be working to remedy one protest, I'm certain all the players are listening to this conversation and hoping that something is asked or something is said that can open the door for a different party to issue a different protest. Because there's a lot of interests at play here, and additional protests will further delay the process and further exacerbate the status quo, all of which we in this room are trying to move beyond. So I think that since we've already established that we are unable to, at this time, consider the more desirable outcome that we were hoping for with a lower insurance cost going into 2019, with this current protest that is not on the table, and any further discussion at this point will just further exacerbate that. I would actually, Mr. Chairman, like to request that we cease discussions at this point, since we've already established all of that for budgetary purposes, and not run the risk of exacerbating these protest circumstances any further.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a very good suggestion. I'm hoping that the comments are just going to be comments, not questions. And I want to thank Mr. Burns for being very, very, very cautious in his responses, and that's why I tried not to say anything either.
If I could request then, Mr. Chairman, a House rule at this juncture that questions be limited strictly to the budgetary nature of the insurance contract that we would have liked to have implemented, and restrict questions with respect to the protest.
Okay, we can discuss that.
Mr. Speaker, I disagree. This is exactly the time we need to know what this committee is doing. And Mr. Burns is a very, he can handle himself. I mean, and he's been advised by a lawyer. He could have his lawyer here. We are the legislature. We need to know what this committee has done that will increase our obligations in the upcoming fiscal year or decrease. And that's exactly what these questions are aimed to. The protests are all matter of record at the public auditor's office. So I think Mr. Byrne is doing a good job sticking to what he knows he can talk about.
And I think at this point, maybe I should, I'll make a comment that I didn't really want to make earlier. That's since I assumed the chairmanship of this committee, and even before me, the predecessor who had this chairmanship, he had passed a law that said that the timeline was supposed to be completed by July the 31st, and that we were supposed to have received that information and included in the budget. In the 5 years that I've had the committee, we've not been able to include it because the negotiations have never been this close to being completed. In fact, this contract has been signed in September every single year since I've had chairmanship. And my good predecessor had a timeline that he wanted to have complied with so that we could be able to include it. But we've never been able to include it. The only number that we've managed to put into the contract is the previous year's contract, and hopefully we have a savings. But I think if Mr. Burns is asked, he'll tell you every year we've been short, that the appropriation that has been set in because of increased cost, not included in the contract because the information wasn't here by July the 31st, wasn't here by August the 31st when we passed the budget, unfortunately forced us to include something that we can either decide to wait until it's done and not have a budget, and we wouldn't be able to get a budget even by November or December if we wanted to know an exact number. So I didn't want to admit that, but I'll admit it at this point that my predecessor had a good plan with a timeline that he wanted to get this done. Unfortunately, all best laid plans sometimes don't come into fruition, and we've got to move a budget through, and the only number that we have is the previous year's budget. Senator Arkin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I have to agree with the previous speaker that Mr. Burns and his responses has been right on point in terms of not exposing, at least from my perspective, any information that is under negotiation or is being protested. So I don't question the responses. I just really appreciate the frankness, no pun intended. You know, just being able to provide members of this body with the appropriate responses and to allude to the possibility of Mr. Burns or yourself or the healthcare chair sharing information that is confidential in nature. I think the three of you have handled yourself very well in terms of ensuring that we don't venture into that arena. So it really comes down to budgetary considerations. You know, we recognize because of the timelines, because of the protests, that our public employees should not be held or hostage in the middle of this entire process, and you're going through entertaining an extension, and we recognize that. We're just trying to look at ways in which we can address some either a reduction in expenditures, maintaining the same level of benefits for our public employees going into the next fiscal year. And that's where the line of questioning is coming in, because we look at this and we definitely don't want our people to be held in the middle of this entire process because the legislature is trying to come up with a budget and because the executive branch is moving forward with an extension. It's recognizing that they're, based on historical information in the past several years and also with the chair of appropriation alluding to Public Law 34-83, that there could be some realizable cost reduction or reduction in expenses in this area. So I appreciate your responses, Mr. Burns. Mr. Speaker, if I could just deviate just very briefly, I want to ask just a general question in regards to desk audits with positions, because there's a provision in the budget that allows for transference of employees from one agency to another, whether it's to, because the DOA director is here, and one of the provisions in the budget allows for that, Mr. Speaker. I'm asking you to please allow me to ask a question.
It's because I want us to move forward, and any question that you have, resolve it now. So yes, I allow the speaker to ask, Vice Speaker to ask her question. I'll allow you to ask your question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In regards to desk audits, especially with regards to GovGuam line agencies, are they applicable across the board? Let me use an example because you have them in your agency. Like, for example, the cashiers for the Treasury. If they're desk audited and it's recognized that, in fact, their position compensation structure should be modified, does that apply to a cashier that is assigned or employed at Department of Revenue and Taxation within the entire government of Guam?
Well, it would apply if they were doing precisely the same tasks as the same position, not person, it's the position that gets audited, the same position in another agency.
So you can take a cashier from DOA and assign them to Rev and Tax to be able to carry out their responsibilities in terms of the collections of and the receipts of cash and funds paid to the government of Guam.
Well, at the moment...
Just so that I can understand how one of the provisions can be applied in this case.
Yeah, I have to say, though, Senator, that we do have Treasurer of Guam cashiers situated at DRT. So I don't know there would be any particular purpose in that, but I guess you're not really referring to that specific transfer, but there wouldn't be any particular purpose in that one.
Okay, so I guess my example was I should have used a different agency rather than DOA and Rev and Tax, because DOA's Treasury or cashiers or Rev and Tax cashiers are assigned from DOA, correct?
We have Treasurer of Guam cashiers situated at DRT, yes.
And they're under your jurisdiction?
Yes,
okay.
They're part of Treasurer of Guam, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to understand how a provision in here can be applied when we're looking at similar positions and assignments from one government agency to another. So I appreciate your response. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Espadon, did you have your hand up? I thought.
Yeah, just going back, Mr. Burns, I may have asked it, but I just, again, in my mind, who sets the split between the government contribution and the member contribution? How is that arrived at? I still not clear. If it's not in law, and if it's not in any rules and regulations pertaining to the committee, who sets the split?
I think the Speaker said that it's a policy decision of the administration.
Of the administration. I see. Okay, so it could change from year to year depending on, I guess, the feeling of the administration.
It could, but the caution that I have said every time I've answered that question is that the carriers look at that split because they feel it affects their risk, i.e. they want the employees to assume some of the risk in order to make sure they don't maximize their claims or over-claim.
Right. Okay, and I have no problem with that answer. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that if we're just looking for, in this instance, about $20 million to make up, and it may not even come, if this government is paying about $70 to $75 million, and we're looking for maybe somewhere that we can find $5 million to contribute to the $20 million shortfall, there's a possibility of the administration making that call to say, hey, there's a potential to be able to make this up by perhaps changing the split of what the government pays and what the employees pay. And I only say that because in the private sector, when I was in the private sector before this public life, I know my insurance, what it cost us, and of course, it was roughly about $1,000 a month that we were putting out. And there were times when I was hoping I'd get sick just so I can use that insurance. I mean, how ironic is that, right? But you figure you're paying for something, you might as well use it. And so, you know, and I say that tongue in cheek, but I figure if I'm paying $1,000 a month, in my present situation, I don't pay anywhere near that. In fact, I think you're right. I pay about 25% of what I used to pay, somewhere around that. And so it just kind of creates some kind of, I guess, opening in my mind as to where we might be able to recover some of the government funds. And because it's in all fairness, if the government is the one paying into this, contributing 75%, let's say, for example, and it covers only government and Guam employees, and yet the cash comes from everybody, not just Guam employees, then there's an unfairness built in terms of the private sector employees, or those who are not covered and not working for government of Guam. And that's the only point, I guess, that keeps churning in my head, that, okay, if we are trying to realign certain aspects of government spending, right, that might be one of the considerations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon. Anybody else have any questions of Mr. Byrne? Vice Speaker?
I just want to, I'm hopeful that because you're having a meeting today, that you're going to take into consideration, yeah, this really sounds like another Simon Sanchez all over again, where we had procurement and we had, you know, protests on the solicitation, only on the solicitation. And I think, you know, even the public auditor in that case said that there were errors made in the solicitation, but the government entrenched itself and fought and refused to just cancel the RFP and start all over. So I'm not going to tell you what to do because, like I said, we're not privy to all of it, but I've been able to review the OPA, and if that's really something, I think that would be in the best interest of the government of Guam, is to go forward with an actual procurement, not to delay and entrench itself to fight this protest. And if it can find a way to move forward with a new procurement, I hope that you guys will consider that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'd like to excuse Mr. Byrne and thank him very much for coming down and being, again, no pun intended, as frank as he has been with us today. Senator Lee, did you have a question? Go ahead, because when he leaves, I want us to go. So.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Byrne, thank you very much for being here this morning. During the budget hearings, I inquired about academies for public safety agencies. So I asked you about GPD. I asked you about anything going on with Customs and Quarantine, as well as the Guam Fire Department. And you said that you were unaware that the Guam Fire Department had any academies currently ongoing, and that you get back to the committee. I'm not sure if you, so I wanted to ask you if you were able to get back to the committee about Guam Fire Department in a timely fashion, and why.
Well,
I just wanted a response.
When you asked the question, I went back to the department and asked for information. I got a little bit of information. I asked for some more, and unfortunately, you know, my time has been distracted into other things. But I will make sure after the meeting today that we get an answer to you.
Thank you.
Senator Arvin?
On my previous request also, please. Just get back to the speaker, okay?
All right. Anybody else? Mr. Burns is going to leave. I'm going to excuse him.
Just one more question, Mr. Speaker, then. Mr. Burns, since you were here during one of the budget hearings, we were informed that there were special funds that were being used to cover general fund obligations, and I wanted to ask you, since then, are there any other special funds that you have used to, contrary to their original purpose?
If you're asking me if we made any transfers
Yes.
out of funds after the budget hearing, the answer is no.
Thank you very much.
Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Burns, again for being here. There's a amendment that's before us, and it's regarding the tax amnesty program. And I just want to do a follow-up because during the public hearing on, I think, the hospital and Simon Sanchez, the two bills, you were asked a question on the remaining funds that you anticipate to be paid by August 6, I believe. Those funds will need an appropriation for you to spend it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so the remaining, can you just repeat again how much is the remaining funds you anticipate by August 6?
Well, I have Mr. Camacho here,
Okay.
which is a luxury, so I will ask him. At the moment, we've received about 60, up to today, we've received about 16 million under the amnesty program.
And those were expended already using prior authorizations, is that correct?
Yes, this, as I explained at that hearing, and as I would want everybody to understand, you know, in the circumstance where we have a general fund deficit, there's always going to be a requirement to pay for expenses that have been previously incurred.
Okay, but you do understand too, though, that if a policy is made here, that those funds that would come in would be used for something else, you know, perhaps next fiscal year's obligations, then that is something that is going to need to be followed. And whatever efforts you're doing now to bring down the deficit, that's not going to be available to you if this passes.
No, I think I said at the end of my response to that same question that if the legislature, and it's perfectly entitled to, chooses to spend funds in a different way, those funds are no longer available to reduce the deficit.
Okay, so just my final thing, Mr. Chair, is that because we don't know when this bill or if it's going to pass prior to you receiving, the government receiving this funds. And so you know, I guess it's just to go on record and just to let you know that there is an amendment before us. There is some desire here in this room to use those funds for another purpose, other than what you may or the governor may seem or may want to use it for now. I think that's just something that this you take it at face value, and that's what we want to do. But at least for the record, I just want you to know that that's something that is going to be entertained by this body. Okay? Thank you very much.
Any other questions of Mr. Byrne? If not, again, I will thank you very much for coming down this morning. We now have the Director of Revenue and Taxation here, and I want to thank the Vice Speaker for providing him a copy of my amendment, and hopefully he's had a chance to review it. And if you wish to ask him questions, any questions, please. Who had questions of the Director of Vice Speaker?
I have one question right now. It's just, what is the estimated amount that you will receive on August 6th? And
on the, you're talking about the
tax amnesty.
Tax amnesty. You know that I just looked at my latest report, and Ed just mentioned that we generally collected about 16 million so far, and we still have to collect about $18 million. And I know that between now and August 6th, we're only looking about maybe 2.5 days of working hours. So that's cutting it close for us. We really are working hard on the amnesty. I'm having all my revenue officers call these people that came up and apply. So we're doing our best.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Madam Vice Speaker? Okay, then Senator Nicholas, then Senator Argon. Go ahead, Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Morning, John.
Good morning.
The outstanding collections balance, the receivables.
Yes.
Could you give me a figure on that?
You know, we've been working on the receivable basically, you know, for the last few weeks, and you know, the receivables that went out, probably about $190 million that we have basically. We've been looking at that. So we went through the process, and then, excuse me, there's a lot of those receivables that needed reconciliation between, you know, our department and also Department of Administration, mainly withholding taxes. So taking that down basically, and when you start looking at the receivables that are already in place, meaning, for example, bankruptcy, litigation, and also this payment plan, and all the others that we looked at, we basically came down to about $73 million that actually we can really go out and go after. So that's basically where we're at right now.
So you have your overall balance was $190 million, but after reconciliations and your own internal review, you're confident that there's about $73 million that over time you can go after and collect.
Yes, yes, because all those, we did a lot of reconciliation. Then we looked at the what's in bankruptcy, what's in litigation, what's under compromise, what's under payment plan, and then when you look at the balance, we arrived at about $73 million that we are actually actively going out and actually collecting from those receivables.
Okay, and but that $73 million is not inclusive of what you already have on payment plans.
What's that?
It's not inclusive of what you already do have on payment plans.
I don't understand.
The $73 million, you mentioned earlier that you had 190 you reconciled. Some of the stuff that you took out when you reconciled was also what you already have on ongoing payment plans?
Yes, yes.
So that $73 million is not including the ongoing payment plans?
Yes, it doesn't include, it's,
Okay.
you took out all the payment plans already.
How
Sorry.
much in payment plans are we looking at also?
Under the payment plan, we have about, I don't think I have the updated numbers, but we have about 16 million.
16?
16 million, I believe.
60 or six or
No,
one?
16 million.
16?
Yeah.
16 million. Okay, so altogether, we're looking at 16 million in ongoing payment plans, and another 73 million in what we're hoping is something that we can go after. So, John, that basically means that you reconciled out $101 million.
Yes, because basically the biggest one that we reconciled, we're reconciling right now is the withholding tax, which is roughly around $40-some million. So those are the things that we're doing right now that I think we're reconciling. I think at the end it's not going to be collectible, in other words. And then if you look at the litigation, we basically have about, I believe, according to this report, about 30.7 million under litigation.
So 40 million, I'm sorry, 40 million was withholding tax that you're not likely going to
Yes,
be able
yes,
to recover.
yes.
And then 30.7 is litigation.
30.7 million.
That's like bankruptcies and
No, bankruptcy is about 9.2.
9.2 on bankruptcies.
Yeah.
The 16 million that you have under payment plan, I know you can't speak about specific taxpayers, but we just recently saw a news report about a particular taxpayer with a $14 million liability. I'm certain that's got to be under a payment plan. So you only have 2 million in additional payment plans in addition to that single taxpayer?
Well, basically, that's what the number I have right now. It's 16.7 million. So that's under the payment plan.
Well, I just wanted to highlight, John, that if 14.7 million of that is, I mean, this is public knowledge. We're not disclosing something that's not in the public domain already. If 14.7 million is a taxpayer that recently filed, that I'm sure is under a payment plan now, and 16.7 is total payment plans as of today, that means you only have 2 million under payment plan out of...
Basically, the process of collection, basically, generally, when you get into payment plans, basically, when a taxpayer owes a certain amount of money, basically, for example, 25,000 or above, generally, if it happens, if there's a payment plan or whatever, generally we actually have to protect the government and file liens. So that lien will generally stay until that tax is paid. So basically, that's the process that we would normally do. So if you have a lien out there, and there's payments that are coming in, that lien will stay there until the taxes are paid.
I understand that. I'm just a little concerned that of the 16.7 million in payment plans, only 2 million are other payment plans, and 14.7 million is just one obligator.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that I would assume that with a huge $190 million or even a aggregate $89 million collectible amount, we would have more under the payment plan program. So we have 73 million that you want to collect, 16 million under payment plan, 89 million total. What's the aging of the 73 million?
The aging, I don't have that report, Senator. There are aging reports that we can look at. Once the tax is assessed, basically we have 10 years from the day that we actually, 10 years from the day it was assessed that we can collect. So every year we have a year 1, year 2, all the way up to year 10. I don't have that report, Senator, right now.
Okay, thank you for being upfront, John. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not sure, maybe the question should have been asked, where did the 14.7 get put in that list? Is it in the 73? Is it in the 16? Can you at least answer that, John?
Was that?
The lien for 14.7, under what category do you have it there? Or is it included?
Well, the report that I have here, and I guess this is a draft report that I have, it's showing 16.7 million. That's with that I have right now under the payment plan.
The question from the speaker, though, is of the 14.7 million in the recent tax filing that's been on the news, that 14.7 million, is that under the payment plan amount of 16.7, or is that still in the 73 million that we're looking forward to collecting at a later date?
Is it in the 73 million? Is that what you're saying? No, it's not. It's the 73 million is an active. And it's not in, what I'm trying to say earlier. I thought we answered that earlier. All these special classes of receivables, we took it out. Basically, we have the 190. We started reconciling. We have all these special classes, and we end up with $73 million of collectible that we're actively going out collecting from the receivables.
Okay. I think there was Uggan, San Augustine, Lee, then we can go back to Vice Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Camacho, for joining us this morning. You know, last year during the budget discussions, there were questions raised about what positions you needed to fill to be able to reinforce the collection process. Of all the positions that were authorized in fiscal year 18, how many have you filled to date?
On those positions, again, Senator, that we...
In this year's budget?
This year's budget?
Yeah.
You know, in the last SCS, I think we discussed that, and most of the positions are filled already, Senator. I think there was just still lacking some position on the collection officer. I think we need at least 3 more that I understand. We were looking at 8. I think we have 5 for the revenue agent. I think we were actually there's 5 for the revenue agents. I think we have 5 already. So we're still working on the vehicle registration and the driver's license. Hopefully we can get those listings from Department of Administration very soon. And I think we filled most of the position on the criminal investigation and the compliance.
So most of your positions, like you alluded to a little earlier,
yes,
have been filled?
Yes.
And some of them have come on board within the last 3 months?
Yes.
So they're still undergoing training and all the necessary prerequisites before they actually are empowered to go out and collect and carry out their responsibilities, correct?
Yes.
Let me ask you, just looking at taxpayers, how many in the last year have actually come in to Revenue Tax and acknowledged that in fact they have an outstanding billing and then either paid it or entered into a payment arrangement? Are you aware of that number?
How many say that again one more time?
How many individual taxpayers or businesses have actually come to Revenue Tax and said, we revamped or re-audited our books, we recognize that we have an outstanding obligation to the government, and actually approached Revenue Tax and said, we need to work out an arrangement for payment of this? Do you know of any companies or any individuals that have done that in the last couple years?
Well, basically, those people that basically understate their liability, they actually go in and actually file returns. Basically, it works both ways. Also, people that are due refunds, they actually go in there and amend their returns.
Okay. I noticed you mentioned that you were able to pick up 8 collectors, 5 revenue agents, and you have possibly filled up your criminal investigation section and your compliance in terms of the additional positions just within this fiscal year alone. Have you seriously looked at recruiting a tax attorney, which is under your mandate, to be able to acquire that legal expertise and that ability to be able to go out and possibly, if taxpayers are not willing to pay their obligation, prosecute some of these outstanding taxpayers?
Yes, we've been trying that for years, Senator. I believe we did a lot of RFPs throughout the years, and there was no takers. We even went as far as going to the IRS, try to get people to be interested to come down and work for us, but maybe it's just the salary that's maybe not very attractive, but we've been doing that and for several years.
When was the last time that you actually put out a...
I got to go back to our personnel and actually see when was the last one, but we do communicate a lot on these things, even in cases that we have big cases with the on court. We try to get people to come in, but it's very hard.
So
to represent the
where do you
government.
get legal guidance? Are you able to, do you have an attorney assigned to you from the Office of the Attorney General?
Yes, the Attorney General is the, basically, once we have cases in court, the Attorney General takes over, yes.
So they get actively
And
involved
they get
and they
actively
work with
involved.
Reverend Tax?
Yes.
So you don't recall when the last employment notification for a tax attorney was sent out to the community from Reverend Tax?
I gotta
mean,
go
is
back.
it
and-
within the last year,
Within
within
the
the
last 1 or 2 years.
Within
But
the
as
last
far
2
as
years?
trying to get somebody to even represent us on big cases, you know, it's very hard. In other words, to try and go out there and get somebody to come over to Guam and represent us. So those are things that we do, you know, moving forward.
Then let me ask you, just looking at the mandate that is with Reverend Tax to hire a tax attorney, would you recommend that we explore the possibility of Reverend Tax actually contracting it out, either to an attorney or to a firm, so that at least you have access, immediate access? I understand, and it's ideal that the Attorney General will be able to assign a full-time legal counsel to Reverend Tax, but I don't believe they have the resources at this point in time. So my question to you is, how can we work with you to assist you to get that legal expertise on board, whether it's through, you just said that trying to recruit has been difficult in the last 2 years or last several years. Is it an option that you would endorse of looking at possibly contracting out an attorney, or so that you can dictate exactly what the compensation may be, or contracting out a firm so that they can provide you that legal guidance and counsel on a more full-time basis and immediately accessible?
Basically, we've been trying very hard. We've been working with the Attorney General's office in getting, you know, people to work for us, actually even to collect for the Department of Revenue and Taxation. So those are the things that we're basically working with the AG. We have a lot of cases that we have that we want to try even on a collection basis, but that's still, you know, in the works with the Department of, with the AG's office. We have a lot of cases on collections that we really want to try and work with the AG to go out and collect from those cases.
See, the
But
challenge I have, Mr. Camacho and Mr. Speaker, is a number was thrown out a little earlier that approximately $101 million is recognized as outstanding tax receivables / uncollectible. So, I mean, when we're looking at something like that, as large as that, there's got to be something, in addition to hiring the necessary personnel, there's got to be something else that this government has got to do to resource the Department of Revenue and Taxation so that you can actually go out and collect on these outstanding tax receivables before they extend beyond 5 or 10 years or 15 years, and they fall into that uncollectible category. So that's why whether it's a tax attorney, whether it's contracting out a legal firm, whether it's you already hired a good number of additional personnel that you've identified in the last year that you needed to bring on board, so you've got that. So is it the automation? Is that an area that you need additional assistance with, or to be provided that additional resource so that you are able to pinpoint when these taxpayers are not meeting their obligation and then paying it and going after that?
I think, you know, it basically is a combination of resources. I mean, manpower, yes, definitely. I mean, if you have receivables out there, like you said, you know, in the millions, and we have so many revenue officers going out there, that's something that, you know, we need to address. And we're putting in another 7 to, at least 8 additional revenue officers into the collection branch. Even with that, with all the receivables that we have, we really need to actually, you know, get more, to be more involved in a lot of these things that we can do. I mean, I know there's a lot of opportunities that we can go out there and actually do seizures. You know, when a taxpayer doesn't pay their taxes, and they have, or they're liquidating, we can actually try to see what we can do to seize those properties. So those are things that we're looking at, and those are the challenges that we have.
So we're looking at, first of all, your biggest concern at the beginning of this fiscal year was resourcing you with the necessary personnel. So you've already been able to bring in some of the individuals
Yes.
that you need. So now looking at addressing the entire process, automation, is that an area that you need to be able to upgrade so that in fact anyone or any individual or any business that has an outstanding receivable in excess of 90 days, automatically the computer red flags them and it goes directly to the director's office or something to that effect? I mean, it's either automation or looking at other areas that needs reinforcement, because I know that you're not able to, your collection agents are not able to go out and actually pursue outstanding tax receivables unless your tax assessment processing division is able to assess it. So are they also properly resourced?
Well, when you look at the entire Department of Revenue and Taxation, automation and e-filing is one of the things that we've been pushing for many years, as you know that. I mean, even as of now, we're looking at what are the possibilities, because this new tax law that just Tax Cut Jobs Act that actually passed actually simplify the filing requirement for all taxpayers. And basically, we're looking at the opportunity, what we can do to actually see we can get a vendor out there to actually, because this is a new tax, no more 1040 AGs, no more 1040As, it's one return. And basically simplified it. I think the return is even a half a page. So I'm working with the physical team, basically the IT people, to see what we can do, basically, if we can push it for this year and people actually file their 2018. It's a new system. We can't delete the old system because people are going to come in and still file their prior year. So, but this new system that basically we want to try and look at is that if we can convince the tax practitioners out there and all the people that actually do this work and e-file this information, we're actually basically cutting down the manpower for all our people that do this. And they actually process 70,000+ returns a year. And these are the things, right now we're meeting with our All-Island Tax Conference. One of the things that we brought up is e-filing, and they're at 79% of all 1040 files, 79% that they don't have to actually process. So, it's something that we really need to do. We've been, talking and trying to get, if we can get some of these things, BPT, rather than processing, 10 to 14,000 every month, where we do get a lot of BPT, but being the only people that don't pay. Yeah. Because, all the exemptions that you have out there. So maybe 1/4 of them are doing it, but the 3/4 are still coming in and filing it, filing the hard copy. So, if we can get those things out of the way and get a lot of these people to do the real work, meaning, everything comes in electronically, we don't have to process all these returns.
And that's where...
And that's part of it. And then, for collection efforts on the other side is we need the technology that you mentioned earlier. If the taxpayer filed their return, and if it's electronically, and the taxpayer doesn't owe, the taxpayer owes taxes, and it doesn't get paid, it's already there. We can actually have the computer, hey, Mr. So-and-so, you file your BPT return of $1,000, please, here's the billing. And so forth. In other words, we have those programs that we can do those things. So first, we got to look at that. How can we improve our technology in our department and get those people to, go in and file electronically? And it works all, whether it's BPT or real property tax. Yeah. Real property tax is another thing. We're doing it already. You can go in basically, and you didn't get your billing. You can go in and actually print it yourself and actually go down to Treasury of Guam and pay it. So those are things that we're doing.
And those are the things that's the information
Yes.
that we need some guidance from you in terms of what resources need to be provided to revenue tax, because whether it's $20 million or an outstanding $73 million that you're sending your people out there to actually go and capture and collect as outstanding tax receivables that are still current, then we need to understand what you need, whether it's upgrading the automation. Do you have an estimated amount? It may not be in fiscal year 19, but at least we can start planning so that in fact we are able to get it in place within a reasonable time frame. I mean, if we're able to come up with identify resources for the automation upgrade, certainly then we need to provide it to you, because one of the biggest challenges that we all have is coming up with a revenue base, knowing full well that there's still an outstanding, starting off with 190, less the uncollectibles, outstanding $73 million that this government really has to go after. And ideally, it should be $190 million. And that's why the use or access of a tax attorney would be very helpful to the department to resource you, so that would be the legal arm to go after some of these individuals and some of these outstanding taxpayers. So I will close with that particular statement. I really appreciate you providing us an update, but we do need information from you in terms of automation. Personnel has been addressed in this fiscal year, so kudos to you and your department for addressing that. Now we need to transition to see what else this body has to finance, find the money, because if we give you automation and it's going to translate into an additional $10 million of reasonable, timely collections, then it would be an investment worth it. And that's where we really have to continue to look at the process and what we can do to resource your department and most importantly, your employees who have to hit the ground running in terms of carrying out and pursuing some of these outstanding tax receivables. So thank you, Mr. Camacho. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Aguilar, while you still have the floor, did you want to address with the director your question as it related to my amendment? Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, because I don't want it to come back and then say, yeah, I didn't get an answer.
It's just, Mr. Speaker, I'm seeing eyes come down to my desk and say,
no, go ahead.
Looking in this direction and saying, okay, you've had enough time to converse with the director. Mr. Director, I'm sure you've had an opportunity to review the amendment before you by Speaker Cruz. And it's looking at including in the levy a language that would read, except, incorporated into the existing paragraph in the law, except that the value of the improvements with an appraised value of $1 million or more as certified by the Board of Equalization each year shall be levied a yearly tax at the rate of 7/9%. Is that language, based on the mover of the amendment, Speaker Cruz, is that sufficient for you to be able to address the intent of his amendment?
Well, it looks like there's going to be three stages here that we're looking at. One for the land, and then one for the building below $1 million, and one above the million and above. I think the way the language or the proposed amendment basically is that the way the real property works is that when we give it to the Board of Equalization, it's already appraised. So, in other words, it should be appraised every 5 years. You know, I'm sorry, but we've been wanting the government's been asking for the budget for us to reappraise it for the last several years.
Actually, Mr. Camacho, if I could just inject, because I think, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, thank you for, I need to focus the question. It's on the process. If DPW provides a permit, and it's only for specifically the Speaker's amendment refers to improvements in excess of $1 million. So let's say DPW approves a permit for a project that's $1.5 million. Department of Land Management also is part of the process in terms of looking at that improvement. The question is, we would have this particular provision in the law if it passes, but then where does revenue tax come in to be able to pursue the collections? Does,
in other words, we look at all the properties. Every property as of the first Monday of the year is actually a lien on the property. So the way we go, because there's different section of the law, this only addresses what is the rate that we're going to apply. So in other words, every property should be appraised every 5 years. So once the property is appraised and it's not reappraised on the next appraisal, which is, I think we were supposed to do it a year ago or 2 years ago, it inherits the last appraisal of that property. In other words, whatever, and it'll follow the rule. In other words, those properties that are coming in, those are new properties that are coming in, if they're appraised at $1 million or more, it'll be part of this rate.
But then that's where the question comes in, because let's say the appraisal is completed this year, and then you have a property owner next year that wants to invest $2 million in improvements to the property. And then your next assessment, revenue tax's next assessment, is not conducted until like 7 years down the road. So the application of this provision on the improvements would not be assessed until 7 years down the road. So that's where I'm asking, where's the connect between DPW communicating with revenue tax, or Department of Land Management communicating with revenue tax, so that that assessment can be provided to the property owner who's investing in improving their asset, their real estate. That's really the question, and I'll close with that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Right now, the process is every year it's a routine. So if this law were to pass, we're going to actually go back and look at all property values that are $1 million and above, and we apply that. If new buildings are coming in, the process is that our appraisal people are actually going to go out and basically appraise this property. So based on that formula that's established by the last appraisal that we did back in 2014, I believe, 14. That's the formula that we have to use, because that's the last formula that we use for appraisal. So every property that comes in, so if that property was built prior to the first March of every year, first Monday of March every year, if it was built, then it'll be in the roll for that particular year. If it's after, then it'll be in the next year. In other words, that's basically what's going to happen. So, in other words, this is, unless we change the other laws, because there's a lien that actually goes on that every first Monday.
I guess because this particular provision would only apply to improvements in excess of $1 million, not the value of the property, but improvements in excess of $1 million. No. That's why the question. Yeah, that's why the question was asked. Does DPW? Where's the process in terms of DPW communicating with revenue tax and saying, here's an assessment or an improvement in excess of $1 million. Now you take over and you assess it. That's all the question is. Now maybe we need to work on that particular process.
Okay. So when we say improvement on this, that means all properties other than land, right? That's basically it. Okay.
Thank you. Hold on.
Mr. Chair, just a follow-up question on that specific point.
You were next on the list, and so you can get your question in, and then it's JSA, then Lee, then...
Yeah, real fast on this very specific point. So when an appraisal is made, first of all, is it revenue tax who actually hires an appraiser to go out and appraise a property?
Yes, the last appraisal done was back in for the tax year 2014.
Right.
So we did hire. We went through the process. We hired an appraiser.
Right. And do you appraise every single property?
The appraisal, yes.
And there was when an appraisal is done, is the appraisal done in total? In other words, it would be land plus the building, and that's what it is? Because what's being presented before us now is basically an increase in property taxes on the improvements alone. Is the appraisal separate?
Yes. When you get your statement, on the statement you're going to see a value fair market value on land and fair market value on,
Okay.
on building.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator San Augustine, then Senator Lee, then Senator Torres, then Vice Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Camacho, definition of improvement on that law. Could you define what the improvement is? Because we had a serious conversation here that the improvement was relating to if you build a ranch or you put a container on your property, that's considered an improvement. And I spoke to some of your folks, and maybe you can validate it, that that's not an improvement. It's if you go and get a construction or get a permit, then that's when the improvement comes in. Or could you define that? What is the definition of improvement?
The improvements is actually the building itself. In other words, if you have say for example, a building of 36 by 46, I think that's, and I have to really be careful here because that's the value that you can actually, and I think I need my people to explain the process, but
Okay.
when you have an appraiser go out, they actually look at the dimension and actually the structure.
But it's mainly improvement is referring to when there's going to be a construction, not just somebody going out there and building a ranch, in other words. Not just somebody
I think-
dropping a container.
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you build a 4 poles on the side and it's all open, that's not being taxed. In other words.
Okay. I just want to get that clarification. And basically,
Yeah.
that's driven by when everybody gets a construction permit.
Yes.
Then that's when the appraisal value will come in because that's provided to the department. Am I correct? Then you will know what it costs to build that.
Yes, that's the process that I said earlier. Every new building that's done every year, we actually go out and appraise those new buildings.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Camacho, for joining us today. I had some questions, follow-up questions to one of the previous speakers. So you mentioned that there is $73 million in outstanding collections.
Yes.
Okay, and then 16 million of that separate
16.7.
payment
Yeah,
plans.
yes.
For a total of 89 million, correct?
No. See, this is what I got to make this clear. What I said earlier is you have that 190 million receivable. So what we did was we basically reviewed that receivable, and then the reconciliation part that we're looking at right now, we reduced that. I think by 50-some million dollars.
Okay.
Reconciliation process that we're doing. Then you reduce that. Then the remaining is on special categories like bankruptcy, payment plans, offer and compromise, and all these things that are already locked in.
Understand.
So what I'm trying to say is that the remaining that is out there that we're looking at is the $73 million that we're actively going out there and putting more levies and all these things, filing warrants and all these things with the Superior Court and doing a lot of these things that we're doing.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I would like further clarification on reconciliation. So you said that we had about 190 million outstanding, and then we've brought it down to 73 million. So that's a really significant amount of money. I wanted to ask you to explain to the body a little bit more about this reconciliation process so we can have a better understanding of how it is you're able to create that big amount.
The reconciliation process basically are those receivables that are there that we had to actually look at and see where they're coming from. So I think we identified at least 44 million on withholding taxes that we had to reconcile. So you take that out, and we look at other of those receivables that we're working right now. The 44 minus 57 minus 44 is we're looking at
What's the 57?
$13 million.
What's the 57? You said 57 minus 44?
No, I'm trying to, the reconciliation process that we're doing right now, we're looking at $57 million to reduce that $190 million. So if you take the 190 and then you less out the 57 that we're reconciling right now, then basically you're looking at 133, right?
Yes.
So within that 133, what I'm saying is that we have a lot of categories that are special accounts, meaning they're already locked in on bankruptcy, which is, I believe, on my report of 9.1, 9.2. Then we have the big accounts. The litigation, in court right now is 30.7. And then we have another account of 5.4 will be on offer and compromise. And then the payment plan is 16.7. So if you add those things up and then you reduce that 190 again, you're actually going to come down to about $73 million roughly that we're looking at. That's what I'm saying.
That remains in outstanding.
Yeah.
Okay. I also wanted, members of the body have been talking a little bit about the tax amnesty, but not including the tax amnesty. How much have you collected so far in this fiscal year?
On tax amnesty?
Not including tax amnesty, how much have you collected so far in this fiscal year?
On receivable, I have to go back, ma'am. I don't have that numbers with me. I just came from an all-island tax company. I happen to have these things because, you know, these things, I know these things are going to come up, but I don't have those numbers. There's like the aging.
If you could please report back to the body with that information. So not including tax amnesty, how much have you collected so far?
But I just want to caution that in part of the tax amnesty also includes receivables. So if you're looking at receivables, you wanted to know how much we collected outside the tax amnesty on receivables. I need to go back and look at that because.
Okay, if you need to include the tax amnesty in that figure, that's fine.
Okay.
Also, I just wanted to verify some response that you had given to a previous question. So if OFB could give me information about in the last budget, how much did we appropriate or how many positions were detailed for collections for DRT? Mr. Camacho is mentioning that 8 positions were slated for collections, but I had, my memory serves, if memory serves, and I thought that was a much larger number. Do you recall, Mr. Speaker?
I think it was 12.
12? Okay.
I think to me, I think it's 10. If I may be wrong.
It was that number.
Yeah.
But Mr. Camacho,
we gave a number, I mean an amount.
Earlier today, in response to another member, you said that number was 8.
Like, this is, you know, when you're given a budget, Senator, and you know, with this Tax Cut Jobs Act, and you know, you look at the budget that we have, you know, everybody had to get a cut, I believe. So those are the things that, you know, we have to spare whatever that, you know, and explain this in the meeting that we had, the ACS meeting. Mm-hmm. But we're trying to put that back again, in other words. So
I just want to reiterate, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here because I feel like every time you come before this body, I bring this up. But even prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you had, you know, several months to be able to make good on this promise that you made to the body. We had asked you, how much do you need? How many revenue collections agents will be required? And we even had some pushback from members about giving you this money. But we did. We appropriated this money for you to make good on that promise. And you had promised us that you would fill these positions within 90 days at the very most. And here we are 9-10 months later, and we still have, you're saying, 3 outstanding. But if we do the math, and there were 10 or 12 positions and you've only filled 5, then
Well, you know, I understand it's the process, and I think, you know, I can't speak on behalf of the DO director, but there's a process, and when we submit those names, those, I
yeah,
mean,
and
what,
we had asked you about that
We
process,
did.
and we had DOA here as well, and they
Yeah.
corroborated what you were saying, that we'd be able to get you that information, and it's just very frustrating because, as we recall, you were mentioning that each revenue collection agent in the course of the fiscal year could potentially collect $1 million. So we're leaving all this money on the table. And when we're considering revenue increases and tax increases on our people, these very basic things of collecting the revenue, collecting the taxes that are already owed to us, just seems like a very basic solution to me.
and we're working towards that, Senator. In other words, we after that meeting, the SAC meeting, basically we met with DOA, and we are working on trying to get those process going, and hopefully that there should be, you know, in a few weeks maybe. I spoke to even the personnel myself personally to try and get these things done.
Okay.
But we're trying our best to try to get it done.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a follow-on question about corporate audits. How many corporate audits have you conducted in this year?
No, I don't have that. I had it for my all island, but I can get those things to you.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I didn't know what it was. I don't know what are the questions to be
how
asked,
much,
but I think.
yeah, so far for me, I asked how much have you collected in this fiscal year, and then how many corporate audits have you conducted?
Sure. I mean, I can basically get those information.
You know, it's my understanding that the IRS currently employs privately contracted collection agents. I think if you look on their website, they have 4 listed. Firms that meet certain standards. Is this something that you have considered? Has DRT ever explored the possibility of hiring a private collection agent to help you with?
Are you saying that IRS is hiring people to collect on their behalf?
Yeah, so they presently employ private collection agents, and there's, I think, 4 different ones listed across the country that assist the IRS in collecting. These companies meet certain standards, and they help them with their collections. Is this something that DRT has explored?
Yes, we did that several years back. We spent a lot of time. We did an RFP on that one, and basically, apparently, there were no takers again for that particular section where basically a vendor out there will actually collect on behalf of the government. Nobody actually came up and said, you know, we'll do this. But I'm surprised that the IRS is doing that, because from my understanding, they stopped that. So I may be wrong.
Okay, I can send you the link that I was able to find over the weekend. But, you know, given this amount of money that we're considering, $190 million, maybe this is something that we can have the Attorney General assist us with, reviewing an agreement that we could put out to other collections agents and see if we can get some help to do this.
Senator, I like I said earlier, on the discussion with Senator Ogden, I did mention that we're working with the Attorney General.
Okay.
We're working on referring cases to their office to assist us on all this, on the collections of the accounts receivable. You know, I just want to say that that's where we're at right now. We've been talking. So, you know, something may happen in the very near future, but the work has been there for some time. We referred a lot of these cases to the AG's office. We even referred cases that actually we want to actually file an injunction on these businesses that are not coming in basically and paying their taxes. So those are the things that we're doing. So we just have to, work with them and see what we can do to, make these things a reality. So we referred a lot of cases of, some of those cases, even just to close a business. So there's so many rules and procedures that you have to actually follow in order to actually close a business. So those are the things that we're looking at.
Thank you, Mr. Camacho. And I just, we're hearing a lot of frustration out there from many members of our community, and I share in that frustration because it just doesn't seem like we should be in the business of increasing taxes if we have all of this left on the table. And so I just want to thank you in advance for everything that you will do to ensure that this 190 million comes into the government of Guam. And we're looking at different ways that we can assist DRT or incentivize DRT to do just that.
Yeah.
So I thank you in advance.
Yeah, just to make sure that I'm clear, that 190 million, again, 57 of that $1 million, I think it's not going to be collectible. In other words, we're reconciling, I said, this is an issue that, an issue on withholding taxes that we're reconciling. So basically, and we're looking at that, and I think what we're going to actually, at the bottom of the line, we're not actually going to collect that $57 million. That's what I said earlier. So,
so that still leaves 133 million.
Yeah, and
that's still a lot of money.
Yeah, but within that 133, again, there's those amounts that are already locked in. I mean, we can't do much about. If it's in bankruptcy, it's there for years sometimes. We can't move on those things. It's in litigation. We have $30 million in litigation. It's not going to move. It's slowly moving, but it's locked in. In other words, we can't, try and collect from them tomorrow or next week or a month. That's what I'm trying to say. Then you got these payment plans that are coming in slowly. And then you got this offer and compromise that we get from taxpayers that we review and actually try to get something going in those things. Those are things that are locked into the receivables. But the remaining that I was saying earlier is the $73 million that we're actually going out and trying to, or aggressively collecting from these people. We've been issuing liens, levies, warrants, and all these things that we're doing.
Thank you. Senator Torres.
Mr. Camacho, I know it's, I just want to acknowledge that you have had some success in collecting and making up for the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and I just want to congratulate your team for your efforts. Because I know that when we did the briefing, there was roughly 13.2 million in non-recurring income taxes that were collected, and then another, to date, just through June, another 11.5 in the tax amnesty. But I just want to ask you very briefly, what is your prognosis for the bed and breakfast registration and assessment of taxes for bed and breakfast establishments and short stay vacation rentals? And then the second one is, what is your progress so far in the tobacco stamp tax program?
Okay, for the bed and breakfast, basically, we're trying to secure what the law allows us to do is to try and secure an MOA with a vendor out there to collect on behalf of the government, and we're still doing that. The only problem is that the vendor that we're actually trying to do is a foreign country, so we're trying to see what we can do is we can get something from the U.S. To do this collection for us. So we're still looking at that. There's a great possibility that we may basically get an MOU. But these vendors out there, they only collect on behalf of the government. They don't give us reports as who it is. In other words, they just basically collect, and here's your 4%, and they turn it over to the government. So those are the things. On the short term, it's fairly new. I think we have one or several that already pick up a license. So it's fairly new. So we're just starting that program right now. And just to let you know, we have a lot of, every year we actually go out and walk the streets of the, looking for these places that basically, when we get calls from outside, basically random calls to look into these things, we do go out there and we verify those complaints. And also the same thing that we're very successful, those are the people that, when on business licenses every year, we do go out and actually look at those people that have not renewed their license. And on the questions on the
tobacco stamp.
tobacco. On the tobacco, where basically, we have a draft of the tobacco law, basically, stamp tobacco law that we have. We have a draft of the regulations, I'm sorry. And then I think we're looking at sending somebody out to look at how these things are operated out there in the States. I think we're sending 1 or 2 person out there to actually look at how, for example, Hawaii operates their stamp tax. So those are things that we're doing. And then hopefully that we can get something going.
What I'm hoping is that with the B&B, you mentioned an MOU for people to go out and collect, but I think the question is how many of those are even recognized and have legitimate business licenses to conduct business? Because I think that's the start of everything. But so far that's been pretty sparse, right?
I believe if I'm not mistaken, it's around 14, 15, I think that come up actually and got a license for the B&B. So that's pretty low, I understand.
Yes.
Vice Speaker, and then Senator Nicholas again.
I wanted to ask John if there's any other option pursuant to the lien instead of the payment plan. Was the payment plan before the lien or after the lien? Is there any other option at this point for quicker collection is the question.
Like I said, on accounts receivables that are I believe from my collection staff, they mentioned if the amount is pretty huge, like $25,000, we normally will go out and file the liens. So
well, I'm asking in this particular case where you filed a lien for 14.
I can't talk specifically, Vice
All right,
Speaker.
well, when you file a lien, do you settle that with a payment plan? Or was the payment plan put in place before you filed the lien?
Well, it's really, there's so many combinations of filing liens. I mean, if I can't contact you and I know you own property, I can actually go out and file those liens just to protect in case that you want to dispose of those properties. So those are the things that we do, yes.
Is there any other options then after you file a lien for a quicker payment rather than resorting to a payment plan?
I mean, in any case, it's based on, when people work with our staff, basically they look at all the financial statements and all these things. So those things that we normally do. I mean, if you come in and you basically owe so much money and you're only getting so much money, then those are the things that we look at. It's required by the collection officers.
All right. I guess that still confuses me when we're talking about a large amount, right? So it's coincidentally very similar to the amount that we were looking to gain from increasing the real property tax.
Like I said earlier, on when you file a lien, once you file that lien, it stays there until the taxes are paid. So, in other words, it won't go until the taxes are paid. That's what
all right, thank you. What is your estimate then on the tobacco stamp? You said you've got to draft rules and regs. Somebody might be going to Hawaii, but what's your estimate of how soon you could pursue that, the rules and regs? Like send them through the process?
The stamp tobacco tax?
Yes.
that's something, that we basically met with the tobacco industry. They had some concerns on this particular law, particularly the process and the machines. So those are things that we talk about basically in our discussion. So what we're actually doing right now is we want to look at how the process works. So that's why we're actually sending 1 or 2 people out there to look at these, how the stamp tax are processed. So that's where we're at right now. And some of the issues that are brought up during our meeting is the cost of these machines. Those things that were brought up during our meeting.
Is there a way to, do you have ideas to expedite that? Or are you waiting for a consensus of the entire industry? Or how, can you be more specific as to the timeline that we can expect to implement that?
We have a group already that we're looking into these things. So we have the draft. So we're looking at moving it. So some of the concerns that are brought up again are the cost of those machines, and even the staff. I think even the public auditor at one time was concerned of how these things is actually to apply the language. So I think they were trying to say that does the tobacco law really on that thing really apply, or does now stamp tobacco apply? So there's a lot of things that are questioned. So, but we're still moving forward.
So you think it would take longer than 90 days?
I can't make any promises, but we're working on it.
All right. So you don't foresee any collection of any revenue pursuant? Well, all right. What about, I wanted to find out, I was reading a 2016 audit by OPA on the Healthcare Trust Fund, or it's really on gaming entities, and she had said that there's a high probability of revenue loss as Department of Revenue and Taxation is not enforcing the limited gaming laws and not reviewing information provided by gaming entities for a predominantly cash industry. Then she went on to talk about how there was not a list of licensees every month that could be compared to the monthly tax compliance, or so that there would be a monthly tax compliance review with those entities on the list. Mm-hmm. And she also said that there were failure to file by some companies, and she also said that there was a failure to issue W-2Gs for those winners. And I was curious if you've taken care of these issues that were brought up in that audit. Well, do you believe you're collecting from the gaming industry?
I believe the concern of that audit basically is saying that we're not. She recommended that the businesses out there on this particular actually put the gross and basically do the exemptions, but the law basically says you're taxed on net if you look at the statute, and that's what basically has been.
I think you might be talking about an ongoing audit.
You're talking about the limited gaming tax, or?
I'm talking about a 2016 audit on not just the limited gaming tax, but all the money that's supposed to be going to the Guam Memorial Healthcare Trust Fund. And so that was, in addition to the limited gaming tax, it was supposed to be the license fees,
yes, I mean, basically, that's the limited gaming tax, right?
Yeah.
Where basically all those people out there are actually have to pay the limited gross receipts, and also for the machines, there's fees on the machines.
Yeah,
yes.
If I may, it says the healthcare.
I mean,
go ahead.
I mean, on those machines, there's basically only 300, I believe, that were grandfathered into this to law. And from those 300 machines, I believe it's a timing difference on those things. But we ensure that those machines are actually being taxed. I think it's $500 per machine. So it's just a timing issue that we have. But you know, we go back to our CCR, our citizen-centric report. We have those reports that we collect on all those machines. And basically, you know, on the gaming tax part, basically there's, you know, I mean, we do collect from those.
So you think you're in compliance versus in 2016 when that audit came out? Because the Healthcare Trust and Development Fund was supposed to be financed by licensing fees, like you said, 500 on those machines.
Right.
And on other types of businesses, the business privilege tax, which was the 4%, and the income tax collected from the companies involved in gaming. All of that was supposed to go into this healthcare trust fund. So
yeah, I think, you know, there's the reconciliation that we worked on that with the Department of Administration, because actually we administer the collection of that, and then when the funds gets to the Department of Administration, they're responsible to actually turn those money over to the specific special fund. So I think there's a little bit issue of that, I think, on the reconciliation.
That's another issue, yes, the turnover. Yeah. Okay.
But it was a small portion, but it was just a reconciliation part.
All right. Is there, under the GRT law, it still provides that there shall be an 8% GRT on poker machines. Are there any poker machines on Guam?
I'm not. The only machines that are out there are allowed by grandfather law, which is the Liberty machine, and those machines which they're applying the 4% limited gaming tax.
Right. And do you consider those then, for purposes of that other GRT law, poker machines? No, or not?
I'm not so sure.
Mr. Speaker?
I don't think so.
In reference to poker machine, as compliance supervisor back then, there is no poker machine allowed. They were all destroyed. They were seized and destroyed.
Yeah.
That's what I want to confirm, because, yeah, the law was not removed, and I was curious if you are...
I saw that it's always there, but I think maybe it's time that it should be removed.
All right, so these machines, you do not classify them as poker?
No, I
All
don't
right.
think so.
And so can you just give us then, to follow up, a list of, I mean, just maybe a statement that says you have a complete list of the licensees and that you check those monthly versus their compliance with the GRTs, I guess?
You're talking
because that was a finding of the audit in 2016.
You're talking about the license fee, right?
Yes. These special licenses.
Mr.
It's
Chair?
license fees and GRT and income tax.
Limited gaming tax. Yes.
Mr. Chair, just to follow up to that, if I may, I want to ask Mr. Camacho. So this is what we've been trying to get also, and that's why the OPA is continuing her audit, right? Is that the Healthcare Trust and Development Fund that she's talking about, is that it's Public Law 3260.
Yes, part of that fund goes there, yes.
So, but the only thing that you're accounting for is that 4% GMHA trust fund. That's the only thing that is being deposited into the healthcare trust fund, when the law that she mentioned really should be the license fees, the income taxes, everything related to those machines need to be accounted for that trust fund, and that hasn't been happening. And so I know it's being collected, but it's just not going to where it should be. So perhaps what needs to be done on your end is to compile all those revenues, because that's really what needs to go into GMH. That's why when you take a look at the reports, Mr. Speaker, it's only very minimal, because they're only depositing that 4%, when really it's got to be way more than that.
I'll work with Ed on that. I'm familiar with the distribution.
Okay.
So, like I said earlier, the funds are coming in, then DOA will be the person to actually send those money to the appropriate special funds.
But I think it's going to need your department to provide.
We have those numbers.
To provide them those,
yes.
because you're only providing them the 4% on top of the GRT. because that's the special assessment of 4%, and that's the only thing you're providing them.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll work on it, Senator.
Anything else, Madam Vice Speaker?
One more, just for the record. Can we expect any immediate or relatively soon collection of any of these outstanding payment plans? So you've got 16.7 pending. Can we expect any of that to be coming in the next 3 months?
Depending on the agreement, every on a payment plan, normally they're on a monthly basis. Could be a payment plan that could be maybe, I don't know what the payment plan.
Could you send us that information? Just what you expect in the next months and for maybe to the end till December?
Sure.
Thank you. Pursuant to payment plan, then. Thank you, Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just some quick follow-up questions. John, we've talked about how liens have been issued for do you know what the total amount has been liened?
You know, I was talking about that, and I think those are probably going to things that we have to be prepared for Thursday. You know, if I think Senator San Augustine is calling an oversight here. I mean, we can get those information of how many liens have been found, the amount of liens that have been found. I think we can get those.
Okay, but you don't have that.
I don't have that right now.
Okay. My only other question was, you know, there's been some conversation about the tax stamp. Based on your feedback, it's sounding like things are kind of getting stuck in the mud. Would you guys be open to us introducing perhaps some public-private partnership legislation that would have a third-party vendor, perhaps, administer the tax stamp program?
Administer the what?
The tobacco tax stamps.
Well, I mean, we're doing our best, Senator, on implementing the tobacco tax. I think a lot of the things that our department is resources, like Senator Agnew and I were talking earlier, talking earlier about resources. It's just a matter of getting the resources, and but if the body wishes to get that thing out there, I mean, that's something that we would follow, where we implement basically what's in the law. I mean, we try. I mean, you know, but if that's what the body wants to do, that's
right. Because all I'm hearing today about the whole conversation about it is that, you know, there's all these concerns and there's no definitive timeline for when it will be implemented, and you know, just all of the stuff coming out on tobacco right now just underscores the need for us to have this more highly regulated tax regime for tobacco. So if the agency is not able to give us a definitive timeline, and if we're not able to get around all the hurdles of various interests on the island, having these meetings and having these concerns, Mr. Chairman, I think we're approaching the point where we're going to have to find a way to create some kind of public-private partnership here, where all DRT does is just put it out for bid for somebody to administer the tax stamp program pursuant to the public law that was established. So we'll be working with the committee on evaluating those other aspects. So you don't have any information on total liens and total?
No,
okay.
I just don't have
But Thursday
that.
we should be able to get that.
We'll provide those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, John. Just one last question from me. Senator Argan asked a question. Oh, okay. No, go ahead, because we have to break.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Camacho.
This.
Second.
Go ahead.
Did I cut?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Mr. Camacho, a couple quick questions. I think at one of the public hearings we had discussed, and I had requested that you look into claims on the Dave Santos Act. Have we made any headway with that? So based on the numbers and claimed exemptions based on data from the audits, there are approximately about 2,500 businesses claiming that they gross less than $50,000 a year, consistently over multiple years. And I just wanted to bring that, I brought that to your attention because I don't think there are 2,500 individual licensed businesses making less than 50,000 a year on the gross. And so even if we were to, you know, consider and said, okay, maybe there's 500 really small businesses that gross less than 50,000 a year, that would leave 2,000 businesses that are, I wouldn't say intentionally, but maybe unintentionally because of a lack of understanding of the law, claiming the $40,000 exemption year after year, which equates to between 2.6 to $2.8 million a year that they might be just willing to pay. Have we looked into that at all?
You know, way back, when we look into the Day Santos, if I recall way back, I think when I don't know, this was way back, like 10 years ago or more, I mean, on the Day Santos. And basically we were looking at it, and when we were running the figures, it was representing around $12 to $15 million, I think that we're giving up on the Day Santos. But I definitely can actually go back and look at it again and see how many businesses are there. We even had a program that we actually go into all the schedules in our 1040s and basically look at how many businesses are reporting, back then it was maybe 25,000 or whatever it is. And we look at it and say how many businesses are actually reporting on their income tax of 25,000 or below, businesses, farming, and all these other that we have. And we came up with that number, but I definitely can go back and look at it again and see the numbers on the Day Santos.
I think the easiest way would be to, I mean, if you can just do even take a sample pool and look at a couple businesses. All you have to do is look at what their GRT inputs, because that's based on the gross.
Yes.
So if their annual reporting on the GRT is in excess of 50,000, they shouldn't be claiming the exemption at all. If the most recent completed tax year had them at 50,000. So I think that would be an easy one to audit, but that's a substantial amount of money. I mean, especially with everything going on. $2.6 to $3 million can fund an entire agency that we're seeing based on the cuts. And so I think in this time, it's significant to look at, instead of looking at other ways we can increase taxes. One final thing I wanted to ask, going back to a statement you had made regarding the real property tax on improvement, can you state again for the record, based on the law, what is defined as an improvement?
Improvement is anything other than land. In other words, when we assess real property tax, we base on land and building. Improvements.
And so what's that by law? What do we define as improvements? Because I just want to bring this up because I think there isn't a consensus in the body as to what improvements we're talking about, and that's what we've been discussing about increasing taxes on.
Well,
what does the law say?
On improvements, like I said, anything that's not basically, it's building. In other words, basically it's building.
So building, what else?
And land will be the other one.
Okay, so, how about what else? What else is defined as improvement? Because I just looked at the statute. There's actually two things.
Okay.
Buildings and permanent structures.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering though, I mean, there could be the potential that we're not taxing things that should otherwise be taxed, or we might be raising taxes on individuals that we don't necessarily intend to do. Because if you look at the law, defined by the law, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important before we talk about increasing the taxes that we're on the same page. So what do you know is defined as a permanent structure?
Well, again, you know, there's a process here. So whenever you get a bill and you say that you know you're being billed for your land and your building, the taxpayer, if the taxpayer disagrees with any of those tax or appraised values, they have a right to appeal. So those are the things that. So if there's any other thing, and we do get that a lot sometimes, you know, especially when we had the revaluation, a lot of people came in and challenged the process.
What I'm trying to get at is it seems like a very inefficient process, and then the way he would explain that it works. Because I think if we're all on the same page based on the definitions in the law, then I think there would be a lot less challenges. I think it's a serious matter moving forward, but especially we're discussing tax increases. And I'm asking you as the director, you know, what do you consider a permanent structure? Because the law, I think, is clear on what a permanent structure is. I know there's been discussion and says,
Yes.
well, it's a permanent structure if you get a permit to build it, but that's not what the law says.
I believe, you know, throughout my time at real property, I think if the structure, if a building is built, they have to go through the process of getting a permit and all these things. Once that building is basically done, then those taxpayers actually come to us.
It seems a bit wonky. So are you
Yeah.
saying that non-conforming structures, more than likely were not built with the permit, are non-conforming structures considered improvements on land based on the law?
From my understanding, that if you build like a garage on the site and it's open, I don't think, I mean, that's not a permanent structure. We don't tax that.
Because
Yeah.
of your time at Rev and Tax.
Yeah.
So do you know what the law says, though? What's considered a permanent fixture? Because the law says anything fixed to either a permanent structure or a building, it says affixed to a building or affixed to land, which could be a ranch with some concrete pillars, affixed with nail, cement, plasters, or bolts. That's what the law says. And I'm just wondering, we're talking about tax increases, and you know, this is what I've talked about, and the law I tried to pass in terms of standard operating procedures. They're not based on the law, the way we're running these agencies, Mr. Chairman. It's based on oral traditions and history. Well, back in my time, 40 years ago, so-and-so told me this, and this is just what we've been doing.
Well, you know what, Senator, I will get back to you on that. I can actually talk to my people that have been there and running these how they define those things. But
please, what I would ask is don't get back to your people. I think there's a lot of legal. There's a lot of legal services that we're paying for as taxpayers. Please get let's get a legal representation.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that if I get back to my people and says there's been rulings, issues on these things already, I can probably come back to say, yes, there was a ruling that was issued by the AG's office on what a permanent structure is, and that's what I'm trying to say. I can get back to you on that and see basically, you know, if anything, you know, arises on those, because throughout the years these things come up, and I just want to make sure that I come back to you and let you know that this is why buildings are enclosed, you know, and it represents what the improvement is, and it doesn't include others that are actually just not permitted, where you put 2 poles or 3, 4 poles and you put a roof on the top, and maybe there's a ruling that I need to go back and actually check and get back to you.
Yeah, because I think if we start looking at, you know, and as we're creating policy, I really appreciate that you're going to do that, because I think that's really important to discuss. Because as far as I know, you know, there's been discussions, well, a container is not considered a permanent structure. I mean, if you want to put a container up right now, you got to get a permit from DPW. You have to put footings in the ground, and you have to attach it. It has to be
Mr. Chairman, I object to this kind of questioning, because number one, he's not a lawyer, he's not giving legal advice. Mr. Camacho offered to get back to his people and get a ruling, and I believe we need to stick to that.
I think we're all getting hangry. Mr. Majority Leader, we'll have to invite him back on Friday, unfortunately, because there are some other questions. Okay, so
I just wanted to make a motion, Mr. Chairman, to close out. I think before we start discussing what we're going to increase taxes
we're
on.
not going to increase. We're going to be breaking at this point until Friday, and you'll be invited back before we do anything. Okay, Mr. Majority Leader, I know we need to break before, and he'll be invited back. You can ask him questions on Friday. Unfortunately, we have to break down. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Chairman, notwithstanding the House rules, I move that we suspend discussion on Bill 323 and until Friday at 9 a.m. For the purpose of receiving the delegates' annual address to be conducted in its formal manner.
Thank you. Inasmuch as we're already in the committee of the whole, we don't need to resolve. So I ask all the members to be back by 6:15, please. It starts at 6:30. All right. So we are for this evening, and then 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And again, I thank you all for coming in this morning at 8.